You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome once again to HorrorBabble. We return today with a substantial slice of Van Melsen in the Owlman of Greenhill Coppice. This time, it's 1986, and we're in Cornwall, where our intrepid detective, aided by his new acquaintance Norman Kane, is investigating the alleged appearance of a legendary cryptid in a remote village. See the video description for chapter times. Artwork by the inimitable Duncan Kay. And for those who may be unaware, the first volume of Van Melsen stories is now available in eBook format. Links below. The Owlman of Greenhill Coppice by Ian Gordon. Preface. Two figures sat in silence in the relative quiet of Kane's rare books. One was the shop's proprietor, Norman Kane, the false-armed Lancastrian antiquarian. The other was Key Phillips, a.k.a. Wax, a student of art and design, and Kane's assistant. The silence was a little awkward for Kane, as he wasn't sure how to break it. Wax, an outspoken young lady at the best of times, had surprised her employer by blurting, quite innocently, a question that had made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a question that very few had asked before, a question that Kane had refused to answer, for the response was difficult to provide, due to both the dormant emotions it stirred in the man and the convoluted details relating to the cause.
Have I overstepped?
Came the considered words of Wax. This query roused her employer from his reveries.
No,
he uttered.
Not at all. It's just that, well, it's a long and strange story.
Wax smiled, her big brown eyes wide with expectation. Kane glanced at the mantel clock perched atop a bookshelf labelled Juvenilia. It was a little after 5 p.m. The shop had just closed, and Wax's shift had just ended.
You'll be heading off in a minute, won't you?
Kane asked.
What do you think?
Said the young student, adjusting her red-rimmed glasses. Kane sighed and raised a plastic limb, inviting her to join him by the piano, a favoured spot for a yarn. Silence was resumed, as the two made themselves comfortable by the vintage upright. 2 glasses were plucked from a hidden drawer, into which Kane poured a splash of clear liquid from a hip flask. Wax frowned.
If you want to hear this story,
her employer droned,
then you'll join me in a drink.
It's a deal.
Wax agreed, sniffing at the contents of the tumbler cautiously. Kane took a sip from his own glass, then sat back in the creaky chair, gazing off into space.
It happened in 86.
He began, his mind's eye now fixed on the memory of a fateful visit to Bodmin in the rugged county of Cornwall. 1. Friday, October 3rd, 1986. Norman Kane, a young man of 24 years, considered himself something of an explorer. His passion for rare books had been instilled in him at a young age, thanks to the copious collection of tomes his father had acquired over a span of 40 years. Richard Kane had been something of an explorer himself, travelling the length and breadth of Britain in quest of unusual and hard-to-find volumes. These adventures, in which a fledgling Norman was often hurled into the back of a maroon Morris Marina, served to fire the boy's imagination. Whether the two were tiptoeing between aisles at Aberdeen's Central Library, or scouring the mismatched shelves of backstreet book dealers in Canterbury. But though his father's collection was impressive, comprising in the main early editions of such classic works as Dracula and The Tale of Peter Rabbit, teenage Norman felt himself drawn towards lesser-known rarities, this being the result of a chance encounter with such a book in the seaside town of Mablethorpe, Lincolnshire. Richard had spotted the inconspicuous-looking volume on a dusty shelf belonging to a short-lived charity shop called Rummage.
What is it?
Norman had inquired of his father. "Never you mind," had been Richard's immediate reply as he collected the blank-covered paperback and proceeded to purchase it for a nominal fee. Norman eventually learned that his father's discovery was a book called Cloaked, a collection of supernatural accounts compiled by the occult researcher Dick Sellers, a volume Norman would later rely upon when pitted against the deadly entity Swaitor in the ancient city of York. And so it was with memories of days out with his father that Cain found himself traipsing up and down the autumnal streets of Bodmin in search of hidden gems. He'd exhausted the coastal towns of Mevagissey and St. Austell, choosing instead to try his luck further inland. Along Fore Street, by the bottom of Beacon Hill, the young man came across the plainly titled store Bodmin Books. In he went, instantly taken by the fine display of local literature in the window. Inside, Cain was greeted by the shop's owner, a middle-aged redhead who offered the intrepid hunter an ear-to-ear grin and a tour of the shop should he need it. Waving a dismissive thanks, he took it upon himself to explore alone, and disappeared into the labyrinthine heart of the store. It was deceptively vast. Descending a spiral staircase, for he always preferred the bottom-up approach, Cain found himself in what appeared to be a reading room, a chaotic one at that. Stacks of books lay higgledy-piggledy about the place, overlooked by tall shelves filled with tomes piled both horizontally and vertically, a detail that made the young bibliophile shudder. A large desk consumed the center of the space, it too covered with myriad volumes, and it soon became apparent that somebody was at work down there, this evidenced by a half-empty cup of tea and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke. Moments later, a figure emerged from one of the room's numerous nook-like aisles. "Hello," said the stranger, spotting Cain at the foot of the stairs.
"Hello,"
he echoed, trying to mask the frown the state of the place had encouraged. The stranger returned to the desk, sat himself down, and took a sip from the cup. The man was tall, thin, and adorned in what Cain could only perceive as some sort of costume, a long black overcoat thrown over a garish velvet blazer. Under that, a tight-fitting purple waistcoat, framing a bright white shirt and a jet-black tie, with short dark hair forced back with copious amounts of wax. A gaunt visage peered down at a journal of sorts, to which the man was now committing sentence after sentence in a cramped hand. To Cain's probing eye, it appeared as though the man had been camped out in the subterranean chamber for a good while, a curious look of expectancy stamped on his bony face. Sensing that he'd had his eyes on the man for far too long, Cain went about his business, scouring the shelves, shaking his head in dismay at the lack of order on display. He'd been in and out of a couple of aisles and was moving in the direction of the stairs when the stranger spoke up again. "After anything in particular?" came the friendly question.
Not really,"
Cain muttered. "Oh," the stranger said, shrugging his shoulders. "Just as well, really," he continued, looking about him. "You'd have a devil of a job finding anything down here." Cain chuckled at this, saying,
"I have to admit, it's not the tidiest shop I've ever seen."
The man at the desk grinned, revealing a set of pearly white gnashes. For some reason or other, Cain's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked,
"Are you working down here?"
"Conducting research," the stranger said, stifling a cough in the process. "I'm an investigator, you know,"
"Yeah?
uttered Cain, dumbly.
What you investigating?"
"Well now," the man at the desk said, turning his attention to the journal before him. He leafed through it in reverse, before arriving at a page with a map sketched on it. "There's a village not far from here," he continued, tapping the map. "They've had a few run-ins with something as of late. I'm swatting up on the local folklore before heading up there."
Run-ins with something?
Kane repeated, frowning. Here the man simply nodded, as though hesitant to elaborate.
What's the name of the village?
Kane asked. Greenhill Coppice, said the stranger. Kane shook his head.
Don't know it.
Few do, the man said. It's a very insular community, and I mean that positively. Again Kane frowned. There was something odd about his present company, and not just in the things the stranger was saying. There was an oddness in the way he was saying them. His statements were guarded, as though testing the waters.
Colour me intrigued,
Kane said. It's an intriguing case, continued the stranger. One of the oddest I've been summoned to investigate.
And just what kind of investigator are you?
Kane managed. The paranormal kind, the stranger volunteered at last.
Ah,
Kane breathed, nodding. You've an interest in the subject? The man went on. Kane thought for a moment before answering. Had he an interest in the paranormal? Well, of course he had. The horror anthologies gifted him as a boy. The off-limits volumes his father kept under lock and key. Those stories Grandma Martin used to tell by the fire at Christmas. And that thing he saw at Mornington House in Rutley. He'd never forget that as long as he lived.
I suppose I have,
he said, his mind awash with childhood memories.
Can you tell me anything about these run-ins you mentioned?
They say it's the Owlman, the stranger announced, his former restraint abandoned.
Owlman?
Kane uttered.
As in the Owlman of Morning?
The stranger's eyes widened. You really do have an interest in the subject, he blurted.
They've seen the Owlman up here?
Kane went on, his face glowing with excitement. So they tell me, the man continued, though it's the presence of the book that drove it home for me. The young bookworm took a step forward, repeating in hushed tones.
Book?
Yes, the man said. An old book, a forbidden book. The appearance of the Owlman seems to be connected in some way to this book.
When you asked earlier if I was after anything in particular,
Kane said tentatively.
Well, I can tell you that I'm a collector of rare books. Forbidden books are often the rarest of all.
The stranger nodded. This is true, he said, and I don't mind telling you. I wouldn't refuse a bit of company on this one. Startled, Kane retreated a step.
Company?
Was all he could marshal. The man at the desk simply said, What do you say?
I'd probably start by asking who you are.
The name's Van Melsen. Peter Van Melsen. And you are?
Norman Kane.
The stranger, now identified as Peter Van Melsen, climbed to his feet and approached Kane. Extending his arm, he said, Pleased to make your acquaintance, Norman.
Likewise,
Kane replied, extending an arm in return, an arm of flesh and blood at that. Then, as though the mere shaking of hands had sealed the deal, Van Melsen said, Shall we talk details then? A short while later, the young book collector Norman Kane and his new associate, the mysterious investigator Peter Van Melsen, had arranged for a private hire vehicle to drive them to the glorious forest, Cardinham Woods, a few miles east of Bodmin. The forest stood at the very southwest edge of the expansive Bodmin Moor, the moor proper being a particularly remote region of windswept hills, home to Brown Willie, Cornwall's highest peak. The driver of the hire car dropped the pair off at a seemingly isolated stretch of Margate Lane, a spot Van Melsen had specified, as it was important, he'd whispered to Kane, that nobody know their destination. The area, naturally, was thickly populated with trees, the canopies above forming a number of covered passageways, any one of which might lead them to Greenhill Coppice. This way, Van Melsen announced, striding off in an easterly direction. his heavy boots crushing the amber leaves that covered the ground. The investigator had been prepared for the adventure. The young explorer, not so much. Kane had booked 2 nights at a quiet guest house in the centre of Bodmin, and it had been necessary to call at his room to change into the most appropriate outfit he could find. Fortunately, his hiking shoes were a staple when on the hunt, and, given the time of year, though applicable at any time of year in Britain, his fleece and raincoat had accompanied him too. Van Melsen had assured him that lodgings would be available in the village, and given the fact that it was late in the afternoon, with a bit of a walk ahead of them, such lodgings would be most welcome, as the idea of backtracking alone through a tract of forest after dark didn't really do it for Kane.
How far's the village from here?
Kane asked. The gaunt figure withdrew a cigarette at that moment and lit it with a sleek metal lighter. Well, he said, inhaling deeply, no more than a mile or so. As I said, we want to arrive in Greenhill with as little fanfare as possible.
What else can you tell me?
Kane pressed, his eyes dancing back and forth between the investigator and the massive birch trees towering above them. I've a contact at the Breadwinner's Grotto, Mr. Winkler, the landlord. He'd read an article of mine in a minor publication. Called me directly. It seems the villagers at Greenhill have been suffering at the hands of this thing for some weeks now. No attacks as of yet, though. Kane frowned.
In what way have they been suffering?
Other than the fact they're seeing a giant feathered man with a pair of wings and the head of an owl? I can't imagine. Here the investigator chuckled, puffing on his cigarette. Kane managed to laugh too, though it didn't quite disguise his horror at hearing a description of the Owlman. His recollections of the creature, as described in the 1976 Morning case, were similar to Van Melsen's description, in that a feathered birdman was sighted above the tower of St. Mornan and St. Stephen's Church. Another report, just a few months after the first, saw 2 young girls claiming they'd had an encounter with a big owl with pointed ears, as big as a man, with glowing eyes and black, pincer-like claws. Numerous reports of sightings followed throughout the late 70s, some adding the detail of a loud, owl-like sound the creature had ostensibly made. Teenage Kane had ingested such tales with fervor, thrilled by the idea that creatures fitting the description of the Owlman might just exist on the periphery of human consciousness. Was he about to encounter the Owlman firsthand? He was both ecstatic and horrified by the prospect. 2. A brisk hike along the leaf-strewn track had delivered the unlikely duo to their destination in a little over 30 minutes. By now, the sun was setting in the east, casting an autumnal glow over the quaint village. They stood at the edge of Greenhill Coppice, atop a small acclivity from which the pair were able to view the entire settlement, nestled in the broad, rolling grove from which it got its name. Stone buildings filled the space below, grey granite cottages in the main, with a few notable landmarks scattered throughout. The village hall with its distinctive clock tower, the market hall, its cast iron and glass roof radiant, and standing tall in the north of the village, St. Bartholomew's Church, its neo-Gothic style quite incongruous with its surroundings. Vast birches and oaks enclosed the settlement, sheltering it from the world at large. In the light of the fading sun, Greenhill appeared warm and friendly, not a bit the cold and foreboding place Kane had expected to find. Picturesque, eh? Van Melsen commented, looking at the young, green-eyed man at his side.
It is that,
Kane returned, taking it all in. The investigator lit another cigarette. See the church? He continued, pointing at St. Bart's. Kane nodded. Winkler tells me the Owlman can be seen some nights perched on the cross at the top. Kane stared at the unusual reddish-brown church, noting its loftiness and the severity of its precipitously pitched roof. But what caught and held his attention was the grand south-facing rose window, a vast stained glass eye that seemed to serve as an eerie sentinel high above the village. He could easily envision the monstrous owlman atop the apex of that ghastly shrine, and found himself shuddering uncontrollably. "Are you all right?" Van Melsen asked.
Oh, yeah.
Kane blurted, clearing his throat. "Come on," the investigator said, stepping onto the gravel road to which the leafy trail had transported them. Following a brief trot, passing several pretty quiet cottages, the pair located the breadwinner's grotto, little more than a cottage itself, its granite walls capped with neat thatching. The pub's signboard was notable, depicting a rotund gentleman with a mound of black fuzzy hair on his face and head, guzzling from a foaming tankard.
Looks like an amiable chap,
Kane muttered, drawing a chuckle from the investigator. It was around 6 p.m. when the two entered the establishment, and it was already busy. This, in part, was due to the fact that it was a Friday, but mainly owing to recent events, which, by the looks on the faces of the punters within, had spooked the villagers thoroughly. The unlikely duo paused on the threshold of the pub, allowing a moment or two for the surprised men and women indoors to resume their hushed discussions. The landlord, Mr. Winkler, or Jim as he was known locally, rushed over to greet the pair, evidently recognizing the investigator from the minor publication he had alluded to earlier. "Mr. Van Melsen," came the words of Winkler through gritted teeth. "You made it." "Indeed," Van Melsen affirmed, shaking Winkler's proffered hand. "Pleased to meet you." "Likewise," Winkler said, turning his attention to the shorter fellow by his side. "A friend of yours, sir?" "A colleague," the investigator immediately replied. "This is Mr. Kane." Winkler gripped Kane's hand with fervor, grinning like the proverbial Cheshire cat. A nervous energy radiated from the man. Kane observed that the landlord of the breadwinner's grotto wasn't too far removed from the character emblazoned on the signboard outside. An older chap, possibly mid-50s, and massive, with bundles of black hair that probably hadn't seen a pair of scissors in decades. The friendly giant escorted the men to a back room of the pub, where drinks were poured for the gasping visitors. It was a tidy, welcoming room, tastefully wallpapered, and furnished with a couple of cracked leather Chesterfields. Van Melsen lit a cigarette, and a discussion followed concerning the current situation in Greenhill. "For the benefit of my friend here," the investigator said, intimating Kane, "please start from the beginning." Winkler nodded and exhaled hoarsely. "Well," the man said, scratching his beard, "I suppose it all started with old Blakely. He owns the lodge across the way, lived here his entire life. Best part of 90 years, you know. He was away on holiday this summer, up in Devon at his sister's place, near Ilfracombe, not far from the coast. Blinding spot it is, no houses for miles, just the hills and the sea. Went up that way myself once." Kane took a sip from the tumbler in his hand. It was apparent to both him and Van Melsen that Winkler's narrative would be full of such asides. Patience would be an important commodity as the evening wore on. "Anyways," Big Jim went on, "he's up there, near Ilfracombe, perusing the recently acquired wares of a middle-of-nowhere store called the Hole in the Wall. They sell junk, you know, stuff they pick up during house clearances and whatnot. Well, old Blakely's sifting through this pile of books, he says, when he spots something unusual, a trifling little thing that looks right out of place next to the likes of your Oxford Learner's Dictionary and whatnot." Winkler took a sip from his own tumbler, wincing as he did so. Old Blakely picks it up, pays a $5 for it. It's an occult manual, he says, a reproduction, he adds, but so rare as to fetch a small fortune if he can put it in the hands of the right buyer. Kane, listening with great interest now, leaned forward, the leather beneath him crackling.
Did he tell you the name of the book?
He asked. "Oh, yeah," Big Jim replied. "Millith." A moment of silence followed. Van Melsen's eyes narrowed as he puffed on the cigarette. Kane was unfamiliar with the book in question, which, as was often the case when he was on the hunt for rare treasures, set his heart racing. "Just out of interest," said the investigator, "does old Blakely have any idea where the dealers at the Hole in the Wall acquired this book?" "I wouldn't know," said Winkler. "You'd have to ask him yourself." Nodding, Van Melsen gestured for Big Jim to continue. The sound of clinking tumblers resounded throughout the room. "Well," the big man continued, "he brought the book back here with the intention of sitting on it for a while. Said he needed to do a bit of reading on the subject of rare book dealers. What a golden oldie like Blakely would want with a pile of cash at his age, I haven't the foggiest. But there he was, confined to his little office, making calls here and there, but for the most part getting nowhere." Here Winkler paused, a pensive expression taking over his face. "Guests at the lodge came and went, with a good few of them, and I know this having overheard them here at the pub, saying Greenhill Lodge was a weird place to stay, that the old man could be heard at night babbling to himself in his study, that the corridors up and down the place were plastered with strange pictures and newspaper clippings. And this is the weirdest part of all, that at the end of their stay, the lodge seemed bigger than it had been when they'd checked in."
Bigger?
This from Kane. "Longer corridors, doors where before there'd been only walls. Strange, eh?" Kane nodded, a befuddled look filling his features. It was as he reached for his tumbler that he caught Van Melsen gawping at him. The investigator's eyes were wide, as if to say, "See what I mean?" Big Jim went on. "Come the middle of September, the tourists had all but stopped passing through, and old Blakely closed his doors. Shortly afterwards, September 16th it was, Nigel, our fishmonger, stormed in here around 7 p.m, kicking up a fuss about something he'd seen on top of St. Bart's."
The Owlman?
This, again, from Kane. Winkler nodded, saying, "There's something on top of the church," Nige was wailing. "God help me if it isn't a giant owl." Of course, we all rushed out, a bunch of us, not really expecting to see anything. But I swear by God Almighty there it was, the Owlman, just as I'd heard it described in the Morning case back in 76. Enormous it was. To be clear, the cross on top of St. Bart's is almost 10 feet tall, and this thing was taller still. Huge, broad wings, giant feathers shimmering in the twilight. I mean, it's a good way from here to the church, but there was no mistaking what we were seeing. And worst of all, the eyes of the thing, glowing like rubies, burning torches they were, unmissable. Both Kane and Van Melsen were practically standing now, glued to the words of the trembling landlord. "That was a little over 2 weeks ago," Winkler said, "and we've seen it a handful of times since. It's an omen, I know it is, and it has something to do with that damned book old Blakely brought back with him. I know it has." Big Jim paused for breath, his wheezing much more prevalent now. Van Melsen lit yet another cigarette, while Kane sat in contemplative silence, his hand stroking the stubble decorating his plump chin. "When we spoke over the phone," the investigator said, "you said you'd try to have a word with old Blakely about the possibility of him taking a guest." Winkler nodded, saying, "I did, and I did. And it was hard work convincing him to talk to me," Big Jim said. "Spent half an hour yelling through the letterbox, you know. But in the end he gave in. Spoke to him through a crack in the door, could just about make him out in the gloom, all gaunt and grubby. Told him you were a rare book dealer, interested in taking a look at his copy of Mythos." Kane eyed Van Melsen at this point. The investigator grinned, and in that moment the young man felt as though he was meant to be in that room, that it had been predetermined somehow. He had questions for Peter Van Melsen, but they'd have to wait for the time being. "And did that do the trick?" the investigator asked. "Seemed to," Winkler said. "He's expecting you at 9. Van Melsen nodded, dropping the cigarette into the tumbler. Glancing at a large round clock on the wall, he said, "We'd better be off then. It's coming up to 8, and I'd like to take a quick look around the village." Big Jim nodded nervously. "Watch your back out there," he warned gravely. Climbing to his feet, the investigator waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about us, Mr. Winkler. We'll deal with old Blakely and get our hands on that book of his before anything else happens." Kane, following Van Melsen's lead, climbed to his feet and stood by the investigator. His thoughts were all over the shop. What the heck was going on? He felt as though his life before today was merely a costume he'd worn, and this new life into which he'd innocently strolled the naked truth beneath. What was this mysterious book that everybody was going on about? Corridors mysteriously extending? Doors appearing out of nowhere? As for the Owlman, Kane didn't even know where to begin as far as that was concerned. "Come on, Norman," the investigator said, and proceeded to thank the landlord of the Breadwinners for his time. "We'll speak again soon," he called over his shoulder, as he and Kane went in search of the exit.
"So, what can you tell me about this Millith?"
Kane inquired as the pair left the pub. The chilly thoroughfare onto which they'd stepped was dark now, frequented by the occasional pedestrian, each of which strode in haste, as if afraid to be outdoors. "It surfaced in the middle of the 19th century, the investigator began, attributed to a magician of sorts known as Montaigne. Some say he moved in the same circles as another infamous magician by the name of Jericho."
"Sorcerella Jericho?"
Kane ventured. "The very same," Van Melsen confirmed. "I see you're not a stranger to this subject." The young bookworm shrugged his shoulders.
"In terms of rare books,"
he said,
"the Sorcerella seems to be more widely known than others."
Van Melsen nodded as the two strolled east along Bodmin Road. "Let's have a look down here," he said, keen to explore a shadowy ginnel between the Breadwinners and a row of cottages. "Montaigne kept a low profile," he went on. "Had an aversion to open spaces, this apparently due to a period of imprisonment in Persia. Millith, essentially, is Montaigne's account of his travels throughout the Middle East, encounters with nomads and traders along the Silk Road, expeditions into the Zagros Mountains, studies with the Magi." Van Melsen paused to inspect a curious bit of graffiti on the wall of the ginnel at the back of the pub. "And here, once again," he said, indicating the graffiti, "we have a bit of synchronicity. Montaigne's captors were said to be representatives of a cult, a group of fanatics fiercely dedicated to the writings of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. Held deep underground in a system of caves in the Alborz range, Montaigne learned all manner of secret and terrible things, committing much of it to parchment, which he later managed to smuggle out with him."
"And the synchronicity?"
Kane asked. "See what's written here?" Van Melsen said, motioning towards the barely discernible etching. Kane moved closer in order to read it. "Those Persian fanatics," the investigator went on, "proclaim themselves followers of Millith." The etching, Kane saw, read, "Millith lives." A moment of silence followed, before he asked,
"Is Millith a deity of some kind?"
"That's one of the questions we've come here to answer," Van Melsen said, setting off again along the ginnel. "And in doing so," he added, "we might just be able to purge this little village of the blight that has settled over it." Kane simply nodded at this, digesting as he did so the curious information he'd just received. He'd heard of Jericho, of course. The Sorcerella was among a number of books his father had labelled taboo. "Too taboo for the likes of you," Richard had said to a fledgling Norman on more than one occasion. But his father had never mentioned this Montaigne character. An intriguing thought occurred to him. Could it be that a man imprisoned by a cult dedicated to the writings of the mad Arab might have had access to the Necronomicon? An earlier, uncorrupted edition, perhaps? And if so, what might the incarcerated magician have learned from the original Kitab al-Azif? These thoughts allowed for a prolonged period of hush, as Kane and Van Melsen traversed the quiet settlement. The investigator led them on a seemingly random circuit through the village, heading north along Middle Street, east by Cardell Road, then back onto Bodmin Road by way of the Quay, crossing the wonderful stone bridge over Greenhill Brook. Just shy of 9 p.m., the pair had reached Greenhill Lodge off Bodmin Road, just southeast of the Breadwinners, when a young woman wrapped in a grey shawl emerged from a passage between the guest house and a disused cottage. And though the girl's face was partially obscured by the shaggy cloak, Kane saw her eyes, 2 shining sapphires lit by the glow of a street lamp. She moved with haste, her gaze fixing on Kane's for a fraction of a second, before crossing the road and vanishing into the night. "Well then," Van Melsen said, snapping Kane out of the trance-like state the hustling lady had unwittingly caused. "Let's see what old Blakely has in store for us." Greenhill Lodge looked ancient, with its dated, half-timbered, black-and-white facade reminiscent of a Tudor house. Van Melsen stepped under the shelter of the jetty and proceeded to knock at the frail-looking door. Moments later, an equally frail-looking figure answered the summons and invited the men inside. And though Jim at the Breadwinners had told old Blakely to expect 1 guest, the proprietor didn't look at all surprised to see the young man at Van Melsen's side. "This way," Blakely all but whispered, the words thick with phlegm. The pair were escorted to what passed for a reception area, a highly polished sideboard at the bottom of a crooked staircase. Under the glare of an unforgiving bulb, the would-be guests got their first look at their would-be host. To refer to the man as old Blakely was an understatement. The character before them, now reaching for a very short pencil, stood hunched to the point of toppling forwards, his back curved like a bow. He was all skin and bone, dressed as he was in just a white vest and navy trousers, a pair of braces shouldering the burden of keeping the latter up. Arms like twigs, hands like claws, this ghost of a man could have passed for 1,000 years old. His face had the likeness of a wrinkly mask, hanging loose from the musculature beneath, and his eyes, just like those of a bloodhound. Ancient Blakely, pencil in claw, proceeded to check the men into the lodge. There was no small talk, just the matter-of-fact approach of one who had conducted the process ad infinitum. And throughout it all, from the answering of the door to the completion of check-in, the ghastly host never once made eye contact with the arrivals. "Can we talk about—" Van Melsen began, only to be interrupted. "In the morning," Blakely sputtered. "Plenty of time for that in the morning." The investigator simply nodded, throwing Kane a wide-eyed glance in the process. Kane shrugged his shoulders as the old man, lowering his upper body like an antique crane, rummaged for a couple of room keys in a drawer of the sideboard. "I'll show you to your rooms," he said, spinning very carefully on his heel. Van Melsen rolled his eyes as Blakely started for the crooked stairs. Kane just about managed to suppress a chuckle. 3. Saturday, October 4th. Van Melsen was sleeping. Having written off the evening, owing to the evasiveness of Michael Blakely, he and Kane had retired to rooms 5 and 7 respectively, deciding to take advantage of an opportunity to rest. It was just after midnight that the investigator had last glanced at the clock by the bed. He'd had a devil of a time getting off. The lodge, apparently, was a hive of activity. Beams moaning above his head, floorboards screeching beneath the bed, distant doors rocking to and fro on their hinges, loose panes of glass tap-tap-tapping for hours on end. And just what old Blakely himself had been up to till midnight, despite telling the pair he was dead on his feet, traipsing up and down the corridors with a pace that seemed inconsistent with the frail shadow of a man they'd met earlier, Van Melsen had shuddered to surmise. And now he was dreaming, a strange dream, the likes of which he'd never experienced before. He was at the top of a mountain. No, he was by the edge of a cliff, and the cliff was underground. Yes, he was in a large cave, looking down upon an immense body of water. A shimmering glacial lake, it seemed, and there was something down there, hovering. A giant blimp, like a zeppelin, only more elaborate. What was it doing down there, floating above a subterranean lake? Who was aboard? But wait, were the hairs standing up on the back of his neck? Yes, they were. Somebody was behind him, approaching slowly and stealthily. Butterflies took up residence in the pit of his stomach. This person meant to do him harm. He could feel it in his dream bones. Only one thing to do. A simple thing, really. Jump. As the dream investigator lurched forward, the sound of knocking in the waking world plucked him from the edge of that precipice, and up he shot in the bed of room 5, sweating, his heart pounding. Across the hall, in room 7, Kane too had heard knocking. It was 2:37 a.m., and he hadn't slept a wink. What troubled the young insomniac, though, was the source of the knocking. It was immediately evident to his alert ears that the rapping hadn't sounded at his door. Rather, it seemed to have sounded from a large wardrobe on the north wall of the room. Overcoming what he felt was an irrational sense of fear, he climbed to his feet, slipped into the dressing robe thrown casually over an armchair by the bed, and approached the wardrobe. Like the sideboard in the hall downstairs, the wardrobe was a gamely, highly polished affair, most likely mahogany, lurking after the fashion of a static behemoth in the shadows. The knocking sounded again, and this time Kane was convinced it was coming from the wardrobe, from within the wardrobe. With visions of Narnia filling his sleep-deprived mind, he swallowed his nerves and yanked the heavy wardrobe door open. Van Melsen, wide awake now, was on his feet following the second bout of knocking. He too donned an available dressing robe and left room 5. Across the shadowy hall he tiptoed, placing an ear against the door to room 7. Hearing muted dialogue on the other side, he set fire to caution and tried the handle. Locked. "Norman?" he called quietly. "Everything all right in there?" The sound of approaching footsteps on the other side of the door reassured the investigator. Seconds later, the door swung inwards, revealing Kane in his own rather fetching white gown. "I heard knocking," Van Melsen went on. Kane nodded, a strange look on his face. "What is it?" the investigator pressed. Maintaining his silence, Kane beckoned him in and pointed at the vast wardrobe on the north wall. "Oh," Van Melsen managed, his face a blank canvas. "Hello?"
Hello.
Came the response from the wardrobe. But it wasn't the wardrobe itself that was speaking. It was the familiar visage of the young lady in the grey shawl, the girl with the sapphire eyes who had passed them in the street the previous evening. "What's going on, Norman?" Van Melsen whispered to Kane. Kane mumbled, scratching his head.
Well, this is Annie, and apparently there's something she wants us to see.
It's true.
The girl said, nodding.
But we haven't much time. Come on.
And she turned, ducking into what appeared to be a narrow passageway behind the wardrobe. The investigator looked at Kane, and they both shrugged before going after her. Meeting Annie on the threshold of the dimly lit passageway, the pair saw that the corridor beyond seemed to be an extension of the wardrobe itself, as though it had been carved of the very same wood.
The lodge changes,
the girl said.
You hear it creaking and groaning, night after night. Some nights it has extra rooms. Other nights it has corridors like this.
How's that possible?
Kane blurted, aghast.
I don't know,
Annie said.
But it started when old Blakely brought that book back.
Millith? Van Melsen put in.
Is that what it's called?
The girl asked, shrugging her shoulders. The investigator nodded. It's a real piece of work, he said, nodding intensely. It shouldn't be here. Certainly not in the hands of one who doesn't know a thing about it.
Where's this corridor go?
Kane continued, His imagination caught up in the strangeness of it all.
My bedroom.
Annie returned matter-of-factly.
Your bedroom?
Kane stammered.
You live here?
The girl shook her head vehemently.
No,
she said.
I live a few streets down from here.
Then how...
Kane began, only to stop when his dark-adapted eyes caught the suggestion of movement a ways down the corridor. When the investigator opened his mouth to speak, Annie shushed him by placing an index finger over her lips. A few tense seconds passed, as the trio waited for whatever it was to cease its shuffling. The light of the corridor afforded enough illumination for Van Melsen and Kane to make out the shape of a figure, some 30 feet or so along the corridor, sitting quietly on a chair.
I know it isn't her,
Annie whispered.
But that lady looks exactly like my grandmother.
Kane swallowed audibly. Van Melsen leaned forward to get a better look at the silhouette in the darkness. Is that what you wanted to show us?
No.
Annie said immediately.
It's what she has on her lap.
It was Van Melsen's turn to gulp. And what's that, exactly? He managed. Annie, her eyes still bright in the shadows, said,
The book.
Ah, the investigator sighed.
Old Blakely hasn't seen it for days.
Annie continued.
It drove him mad, turned the lodge inside out, then disappeared. Turns out Granny's been holding on to it.
Kane tapped Annie on the shoulder.
So, what now? I hope you're not expecting one of us to go after it.
She looks like my grandmother,
Annie said, still whispering.
I don't want to go anywhere near her.
Van Melsen, knowing what was expected of him, puffed out his chest, tightened the dressing robe around his waist, and stepped into the passageway proper.
Be careful,
Annie quietly called after him. The investigator paid no heed to her words, simply edged forwards, one bare foot at a time, along the curious wooden corridor. Everything about the passage was wrong. The homogeneous wood comprising floor, walls, and ceiling, the inexplicable glow that seemed to emanate from the very air about him, air that was appallingly close and humid, and the dreadful silence of the place, as though he'd stepped into a sort of limbo space between two worlds. He could feel his heart still thumping in his chest, memories of the strange dream still lingering on the edge of his perception. Granny was a little clearer now, a diminutive figure, sitting in complete stillness on the chair. A Queen Anne it was, its arms supporting the lifeless limbs of its occupant. As Van Melsen neared the inert form, he imagined himself as a child, playing the quiet game. In order to win the quiet game, absolute silence must be maintained. No sudden movements, no heavy footsteps, no sneezes or involuntary coughs. And then it occurred to him, what exactly was this strange being ahead of him? Why had it chosen to take the form of the young lady's grandmother? Was it an attempt to lure her? Would it, he now pondered, choose to take the form of someone from his life? His grandmother? Just stop, he thought to himself. It doesn't matter. Not right now, anyway. Within a couple of feet of the frozen figure, the investigator spotted the prize on the old lady's lap. Just focus on the book, his thoughts went on. Don't look at the face. Anything but the face. But the very thought persuaded him to do just that. And what followed transpired in less than 10 seconds. Van Melsen's eyes moved in the direction of Granny's head, and found not a face, but a mask of petrified wood, with gaping black recesses where the eyes should have been, and an upturned slit in place of a mouth. Wiry stems protruded from the wooden head, curved and snake-like, a poor imitation of human hair. Seeing this, the investigator let out a frenzied gasp, the intensity of which had the unfortunate effect of bringing the petrified lady back to life. The head pivoted round to face him, creaking as it did so, sounding just like the moans and screeches that had resounded throughout the house after bedtime. Leaping forward, he grabbed the book from Granny's lap and took off running the way he came, narrowly avoiding the questing, gnarled hand that sought to grab him.
"Hurry!"
cried Annie, waving her hands in the air, Kane by her side, eyes wide and disbelieving. Van Melsen galloped, the white robe flailing behind him, a target for the groaning, wooden monstrosity that was after him. The thing grasped and lunged, brushing but not quite touching that which it so desperately sought. The two on the threshold quickly retreated, encouraging the investigator as they did so.
"You can make it!"
Annie yelled, as with one tremendous act of will, Van Melsen hurled himself forwards, like one competing in the long jump, landing on his backside in the middle of room 7. Kane, coming to his senses at last, pushed Annie aside and reached for the wardrobe door. The wooden mass, for that was what it now resembled, a veritable storm of lumber hurtling towards room 7, came within a few inches of the door as the young man slammed it closed. One final groan echoed on the other side, the cry of something defeated, and then there was silence. And all that in less than 10 seconds. In the middle of the room, his chest rising and falling, like the ebb and flow of a turbulent tide, Van Melsen clutched the copy of Mythos in his bony hands, a small, leather-bound book with faded, gilt edges, an anonymous-looking tome by all accounts.
"What now?"
asked Kane, wearing the look of one just roused from a particularly vivid nightmare. "We've a bit of reading to do," babbled the investigator, holding the book in one hand and with the other searching the empty pockets of the dressing gown for a cigarette. With understandable trepidation, the three that had escaped the clutches of the wooden lady established themselves in room 5, eager to remain there till dawn. Here, Van Melsen found a cigarette and lit it hastily. Kane, still bewildered, looked to the girl with the sapphire eyes questioningly.
"I was at home sleeping,"
she began.
"It was a gust of air that woke me, blew right across my face. I shot up and found myself looking into that wooden tunnel. It's weird. I'd overheard talk of guests experiencing strange things at the lodge, so I kind of just accepted what I was seeing."
Van Melsen, inhaling deeply, listened to Annie's account intently, as he sat himself cross-legged by the room's only window. Light from a street lamp fell on him, highlighting the sharp lines of his gaunt face.
"I dressed,"
Annie continued,
"and decided to check it out. There was a voice in the back of my head telling me to enter the tunnel, to follow it to the opposite end, where I'd find you."
This she said while looking at Kane.
"What voice?"
Kane asked.
"I can't explain it. If anything, it sounded like my own voice."
"Go on."
Kane urged.
"I did as the voice commanded.
Annie went on.
I made my way along the tunnel. The old woman in the chair was at the midpoint between my room and yours. I knew what she was holding the second I saw it. I've eavesdropping to thank for that, too. But I wasn't expecting to see Granny in there. What the hell was that thing?"
"If it's what I think it is," Van Melsen volunteered, "you might call it a cow. I'm guessing here, but it's possible the thing took on the form of your grandmother to deter you from going after the book." Annie frowned, exhaling deeply.
"Cow?"
Kane asked for clarification. K-O-W, cow. Occupants of a limbo-like plane, referred to, in some circles at least, as the fringe. They're impersonators, using their shape-shifting abilities to steal objects of perceived value from those foolish enough to enter their realm. With their ill-gotten gains, they seek to curry favor with higher powers by offering gifts. In this case, a worthless copy of Mythos.
"Worthless?"
This from Annie. "Look," the investigator invited, flicking through the retrieved book. "There are pages missing, torn out and presumably incinerated."
"Blakely's work?"
Kane ventured. "Assuredly," Van Melsen said, puffing on the cigarette. "It seems clear to me that the book seduced our old friend, drawn in by what he read there, easily done, this being an English translation of the text. He likely recited one or several of its verses, or cantor rhythms as they're known, and quite possibly produced what some have called a localized rift between this reality and the fringe.
And he just torched the pages afterwards?
Kane asked. Necessary to perform this kind of incantation. Kane scratched his chin thoughtfully. Annie frowned again, but the look on her face was that of one convinced.
And this is the cause of everything happening in Greenhill?
She asked. The investigator shrugged his shoulders. Either way, the really troubling part, he went on, is that the presence of a cow usually indicates the presence of those higher powers they seek to cajole. Here, Van Melsen looked to Annie. Have you seen this owl man, Annie? The girl shook her head.
I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it with my own eyes.
Van Melsen nodded, turning his attention to the book before him. Kane approached and dropped into position next to him on the wooden floor. Annie followed suit, and the three of them sat quietly, listening to the worrying creaks and groans echoing throughout the old lodge. Now patently aware of the potential source of the sounds, the trio sat rigid with apprehension. Docking his cigarette carefully, Van Melsen began flicking through the leather-bound book, educating his company to the best of his ability with regards to contents familiar to him, and shaking his head in puzzlement when encountering contents unfamiliar. The problem with copies such as this, he said, is that much is lost in translation. It might very well be that certain verses and incantations are perfectly translated, whilst the corresponding revocations are either hopelessly translated or missing entirely. Without speaking to old Blakely, it's impossible to tell just what it was he recited. It'll be tough to undo if he can't or won't tell us. This passage here, however, he continued, indicating a sequence of paragraphs and quotations, may at least shed some light on what it is we're up against. The section in question, found towards the end of the book, was described as a cryptic paraphrasing of data found in that most abhorred of grimoires, the Mad Arab's Necronomicon, a section concerning the nature of the malevolent being, Millith. Millith is a harbinger of dread, a void-bound being whose visage is a subterranean slime. It is said that when the veil between dimensions is thin, worn down by the relentless flow of time, Millith seeks the light, driven by a purpose as mysterious as it is abhorrent. Upon its emergence, Millith selects a semblance, and with a queer hunger born of the abyss, it preys upon the creatures of light, stealing them from the sun, and wrenching them into the inky blackness of the void. In the depths of that barren realm of shadow, the kidnapped souls are subjected to a fate too ghastly to comprehend. Whispers told over the embers of dying fires tell of a veritable hell, where Millith watches over black cauldrons of bubbling shadow, wherein the muted victims of light boil and liquefy over and over again, a process unmarked by the passage of time, an eternity of indescribable suffering, which to Millith is as air to human lungs. The purpose of these monstrous abductions remains a riddle that continues to elude the most erudite of scholars. But speculation is rife. Rituals of cosmic manipulation, the sowing of discordant energies, vibrations designed to further corrode the veil between dimensions. Others suggest that Millith seeks to permanently eliminate the veil, whereupon the void will spill into the world of light and absorb it utterly. Legends speak of brave souls who have embarked on perilous journeys to retrieve those ensnared by Millith's grasp, venturing into the abyss by way of astral travel. But such quests are fraught with peril, for the realm of Millith is a labyrinth of shifting perceptions, an ever-changing expanse that has no capacity for logic or reason. None who venture there return with their minds intact, their rambling tales fragmented and irrational. Beware the whispers that herald Milith's arrival, for its presence represents a rupture in the natural order, a tear in the very tapestry of reality. When the veil between dimensions is thin, it is the duty of those who wield the forbidden knowledge to guard against Milith, to seal the boundaries that shelter the world of light from the clutches of the void-bound fiend. The secrets of Milith remain a riddle that humankind may never fully decipher, a shadowy enigma that serves as a grim reminder of the terrors that lurk beyond the threshold of our understanding. "In the morning," muttered Van Melsen, shuddering, "we'll meet again with Mr. Blakely and see if we can't formulate a plan of action. For now, I think we should try to get some rest. We're going to need it." 4. The remainder of those early Saturday hours were spent in and out of light sleep. The unlikely trio sprawled across the floor atop duvets, throws, and a dozen pillows. Dreams were brief but vivid, in which, collectively, the three near strangers saw the wooden face of Granny, pursuing them across interminable gulfs of darkness, and always in the shadow of a giant owl, a spectral demon in the shape of a bird. Dawn finally broke, and as it did, Van Melsen, Kane, and Annie took their turns in the small bathroom, splashing water on their faces, and, in the cases of the investigator and the bookworm, dressing for the day ahead. It was around 7:45 a.m. when the trio took their leave of room 5. Van Melsen, taking the lead, suggested a quick glimpse inside Kane's wardrobe, to which the young man protested vehemently, insisting that the three of them had done well enough to escape the cow in the first place. Wardrobe aside, a thorough search of the lodge was conducted, which, according to Annie, appeared as it should, with no new rooms or supplementary corridors. As for old Blakely, the proprietor of the guest house was nowhere to be found.
"Could he have stepped out for a breath of fresh air?"
Kane ventured. Annie immediately shook her head.
I doubt it.
She said.
He hasn't left the house in weeks.
"Are you sure about that?" Van Melsen put in. Annie went to speak, but hesitated. The investigator's comment was prompted by a desk in what evidently served as Blakely's office. Atop the desk were scattered numerous sheets of paper, some the nonsensical scribblings of a befuddled mind, others displaying maps of the village, one of which had specific locations marked. A row of houses on the south side of the village, St. Bart's to the north, and a seemingly random location in the forest to the east. What could our unwitting warlock have found notable about these particular locations? Van Melsen mused. "Look at this," he went on, indicating a handwritten note above the spot marked in the forest. "Cuthbert,"
Cuthbert Baxter,
said Annie.
our greengrocer.
"He lives in the forest?"
Kane ventured.
No,
She replied, shaking her head.
he lives on Barker's Row, the row of houses marked on the map there.
"Interesting," Van Melsen murmured. "Perhaps this fellow can tell us the whereabouts of old Blakely." Bundling a selection of papers into his satchel, the investigator ushered them out of the lodge. A 5-minute trundle across the village was all it took to reach Barker's Row, a small street consisting of 7 cottages overlooking a stagnant pond to the east. Like the rest of Greenhill Coppice that Saturday morning, the scene was extremely hushed, as though the residents had decided to pack up and disappear, leaving a ghost town in their wake. "Which house is Cuthbert's?" the investigator asked.
The last cottage on the right.
Annie answered.
Number 6.
As Van Melsen carried out his methodical business, studying the brickwork of the greystone dwellings, looking up at the neatly thatched roofs, sniffing the air for goodness knows what, Kane became gradually conscious of a voice in the back of his mind. Nor did it emanate from the trees that surrounded the village. Akin to the voice Annie had described that spoke to her in the night, this voice was very much his own voice, but disconnected from him in a way that he had never before experienced, as though a piece of him was floating in the air above his head. And it was only the tone that was familiar, because he couldn't make out a single word the voice was saying. There was a monotony to it, like a repeated mantra, which stirred in him visions of a dark passageway, a claustrophobic tunnel from which poured a noxious arrangement of cacophonous bellows. There was an urgency to the mantra, but it was much too vague, and ultimately too fleeting to impart anything tangible. Finally, the hollowed words of the man in the long black overcoat broke the spell. "Quickly!" Van Melsen called, with a touch of excitement. Annie, with Kane at her heels, approached the investigator, who was standing by the door of number 6, his eyes wide. The door, they saw, was ajar, and from within, like steam escaping from a Manhattan manhole cover, there leaked a low moaning, the source of which was a rasping voice all three present recognized. Van Melsen pushed the door open, and as Hansel and Gretel followed the trail of breadcrumbs, traced the groan, which led them to the kitchen at the back of the cottage. The sight that awaited them was both ghastly and strange.
"What?"
started Annie, only to throw a hand over her mouth in alarm and repulsion. The two men just stood there on the threshold of the cramped space, their gazes fixed on the shape, standing upright at the center of the room.
"Blakely,"
Kane managed, his brow creased. And it was the old man, or it had been the old man. For now, all that remained of Michael Blakely was a translucent skin in the shape of a crooked human being, a skin shed after the fashion of a snake, or, more fittingly, a tarantula. The groan the trio had followed faded now, as the last of it escaped from the figure's dried-up lips, and in his shriveled hands, capped beneath his withered chin, was a plain silver key.
"What happened to him?"
Annie managed at last. "I wouldn't dare conjecture," Van Melsen said, moving forward a couple of paces. "But I will say that old Blakely has been on borrowed time for a while now. Whatever he was hoping to achieve this morning, you can be sure it has something to do with that key he's clutching." A search of the small cottage ensued, resulting in little but frustration. Cuthbert Baxter, greengrocer, kept nothing of value at his humble abode, certainly not a safe necessitating a silver key, nor a hidden door in the cellar that the investigator seemed positive he would discover. Baxter's possessions were bland and uninteresting, from the faded photographs of his appearances at multiple food festivals adorning the walls of the living room to the collection of British bird miniatures on the dresser in his bedroom. Returning to the kitchen, the trio were horrified to discover that the shed skin of Blakely had deflated like a balloon, resembling little more than an untidy pile of leather on the cold tiles.
"What should we do about him?"
Kane asked, staring in disbelief at the remains of the old man. "I suggest we reconvene with Mr. Wilkins," Van Melsen said. "We'll need to alert the authorities." Kane was about to speak when the investigator continued. "However," he went on, "I'd like to pay a visit to the marked spot in the woods prior to doing so. How far is it from here, Annie?" The young lady shrugged, saying,
10 minutes.
"What do you say?" Van Melsen inquired, addressing both Kane and Annie. The pair nodded simultaneously, knowing that to say no was to miss out on something potentially awesome and strange. "Lead the way, Annie," the investigator said. By 9 a.m., the three of them were trudging through Cardinham Woods in search of the second location marked on old Blakely's map. Annie was at the head of the group, making her way with familiarity. This pleased Kane, for 2 reasons. One, it was always good to have a member of the local community on board as a guide. And 2, he found himself drawn to the sapphire-eyed girl. She was headstrong and daring, from a family of butchers he'd learned on the hike, a young lady skilled in the art of butchery, with a great respect for the animals from which her family made their living.
"We're almost there,"
Annie said, smiling, in spite of the recent strangeness. Approaching a large tree, an English oak as evidenced by the plethora of acorns littering the forest floor below it, the young lady stopped. Kane looked, and saw that she had trod upon what appeared to be a hatch in the ground, a hatch that had been recently accessed, if the lack of acorns atop it was anything to go by.
"This is the spot,"
Annie announced, tapping the hatch with a booted foot.
"How do I know? Well, I can tell you now. I've never seen this hatch before."
Van Melsen stepped forward. "And wouldn't you know it," he said humorously, "there's a keyhole. I wonder." The investigator gripped a recessed latch and attempted to lift the hatch. It refused to yield to his efforts. And so he withdrew the silver key from an inside pocket and tried it in the lock. "Eureka!" he gloated, grinning. Kane saw that the lanky character was in his element here, possibly more than that. It was as though the investigator had anticipated something like this. Withdrawing a cigarette, Van Melsen said, "There's something down there, and we need to find out what it is." The girl in the grey shawl approached Kane at this juncture, evidently drawn by the look on his face.
"Are you okay?"
she asked. Startled, Kane replied,
Me? Oh yeah, of course.
But Annie, and the man by the hatch with the cigarette in his mouth, saw right through Kane's poor attempt at bravado.
All right.
Kane yielded.
If you must know, I can't shake the image of old Blakely from my mind. All dried out like that. Just desiccated skin. Nothing underneath. What happened to the rest of him, for Christ's sake?
Here, Annie placed a hand on his shoulder.
"I know.
She sympathized.
It's at the forefront of my mind, too."
As it should be, the investigator piped up. You'd have to be missing a brain to see a thing like that and walk away unscathed.
How do you deal with it?
Kane asked. I just move on to the next piece of the puzzle, he said, blowing rings of smoke into the cool air. There's always plenty of time to reflect when the puzzle's solved. Kane, marginally reassured, but still haunted by the picture in his mind, simply nodded and attempted to smile. Annie returned the smile, which Kane found to be much more reassuring than anything the chain-smoking detective had said. Are we about ready? Van Melsen asked, docking the cigarette.
Yes,
Annie said, eyeing Kane with those blue sapphires. The young man sighed and started towards the hatch.
Let's do it,
he said. It was Annie who opened the hatch. It came up with little effort, revealing a dimly lit staircase. This surprised the young lady.
I'm not sure what I was expecting to find,
she said.
But it definitely wasn't a flight of stairs.
The steps were of stone, and when the trio crouched to get a better view below, they could just about make out a small chamber at the bottom of the flight. Kane surprised his companions by taking the first step. A rush of adrenaline had swept through his veins, and he wanted to make the most of it. Down he went, step by step, Annie directly behind him, and Van Melsen taking up the rear. Reaching the bottom, they found themselves in a cramped space, stone walls enclosing a plain wooden desk, behind which sat a motionless figure, a figure whose very lack of movement had each of them thinking of the cow they'd encountered back at the lodge.
Is that...
Kane began, only to have Annie complete his question.
Mr. Baxter, yes,
she affirmed. She took a step towards the desk.
Mr. Baxter?
She called quietly.
Cuthbert, are you all right?
But Baxter remained fixed and motionless.
Is it him?
Kane said in an aside to Van Melsen.
Or does it just look like him?
It's difficult to say, he answered conservatively. Kane studied the figure minutely. The man was a scrawny individual, with an oddly wide head and pronounced cheekbones. A pair of round glasses reflected the light of a candle that sat on the desk in front of him, making the eyes behind them impossible to see. Baxter's arms, long and wiry, were crossed over his chest in an attitude of outright defiance. But the most unusual thing about him was the man's skin. It appeared grey and glossy, brittle even, just like the stone of the walls that made up the chamber. "Mr. Baxter?" Van Melsen ventured, joining Annie. "What are you doing down here?" But still, the scrawny man remained stationary. Kane, cautious but not afraid, met his companions, as the investigator withdrew the copy of Mythos from the satchel at his side. Turning towards the back of the small volume, Van Melsen studied what was written there.
"Cuthbert?"
Annie called again, looking at the table before the man. Aside from the candle, an ordinary church candle, the table was bare. Suddenly, the investigator yelled, "Cowwack Downack!"
What?
Kane began, but soon abandoned his speech when he saw the effect of Van Melsen's strange utterance. The former statue, Cuthbert Baxter, was now alert. Uncrossing his stiff arms, he placed them on the table in front of him. "One," the man immediately said, his voice little more than the sawtooth drone of a synthesizer. "With moonstone in hand, summon the barn owls." Van Melsen, ready for this outpouring of information it would seem, had armed himself with a pencil, and was noting down Mr. Baxter's words in the back of Mythos. "Two," Cuthbert continued, his stony face alive with motion now. "Grind a powder of mugwort, lavender, and yarrow. A portion must be sown if you're to see new tomorrows." Kane frowned. Annie stared. The investigator scribbled maniacally. "And 3, Cuthbert said, indicating a final instruction. "With fire in your belly, you must seek out his lair. From there and only there can he return to elsewhere." Van Melsen, with great haste, committed these last words to the back page of Mythos, and it was soon glaringly obvious as to why he had worked so rapidly. Mr. Baxter, once an unassuming greengrocer from the quiet village of Greenhill Coppice, was now a cow, an occupant of the fringe, a servitor of Mythos. The investigator had manipulated the man of stone into divulging a sacred secret, a terrible theft, an unforgivable crime, for which the interloper would pay the ultimate price. "Move!" Van Melsen bellowed, grabbing both Kane and Annie by the scruffs of their necks, as the clumsy effigy lunged forwards, its cold limbs reaching, clutching, and a moan, a guttural, synthetic whimper accompanied that lunge, a desperate cry, the wail of the damned. The 3 of them darted for the stone steps, leaping up them 3 at a time. Once again, Van Melsen found himself within whisper distance of a questing cow, its limbs now little more than flailing tentacles, scrabbling at his back, his elbows, the hair atop his head. Like the waters of a geyser, Kane, followed by Annie, and lastly Van Melsen, spewed out of the hatch, leaping clear of the seeking extremities of the cow, finding comfort atop the acorn-strewn earth of Cardinham Woods. Before the fortunate fleers had even realized they'd made it, the cow was gone, as was the hatch, and any sign that it had ever been there. Panting, his heart threatening to burst out of his chest, Van Melsen withdrew a cigarette and lit it promptly. "I must apologize," he said, wheezing. "I should have descended alone. An unnecessary risk for the 2 of you. Please, accept my apologies." Kane looked at the gaunt figure next to him on the leafy ground. This was the first time since their meeting the day before that the investigator had let his mask slip, the facade of the self-assured detective.
"It's okay,"
Annie said, a little red in the face.
"I wouldn't have missed it for the world."
Kane shuddered, then chuckled, which, bizarrely, triggered a similar reaction in Van Melsen, who burst into a fit of laughter, his mouth a cavern of mirth, from which streamed the most infectious, raucous howl the young bookworm had ever heard. Later, Kane would look back on this moment as one of the last, truly joyous events of his life, 3 strangers who became overnight friends thanks to a threat from another world. Jocularity aside, Van Melsen said, still tittering, we need to be very careful from now on. These instructions here, he went on, holding up the copy of Mythos, need to be carried out to the letter, which, unfortunately, will require some thought on my part. We should head to the breadwinners. I suggest we hole up there for a while. And so, the unlikely trio, startled but still alive, climbed to their feet and marched their way back through the damp forest to the breadwinner's grotto. 5. Mr. Winkler, whose doors were not yet open at 11 that Saturday morning, greeted Van Melsen and company with a great deal of enthusiasm. He ushered them into the empty bar area, where the 3 of them were invited to take a seat. Instructions were hollowed over a large shoulder towards what was clearly the kitchen, from which direction shortly followed the unmistakable sounds of food preparation, the sizzling of pans, and the opening of tins. "You look famished, the 3 of you," he said, as he added tea bags to 3 mugs plucked from behind the bar. A kettle was immediately put into action, much to the pleasure of the survivors of Cuthbert the Cow's attack. "So tell me," Big Jim went on, "what on earth is going on?" Clutching a mug in one hand and an unlit cigarette in the other, Van Melsen proceeded to bring the landlord of the Breadwinner's Grotto up to speed. The acquisition of the book at Greenhill Lodge, the fate of old Blakely at Barker's Row, and the macabre encounter with an altered Mr. Baxter in Cardinham Woods. Big Jim, reaching for his own mug, a cup he'd not so discreetly added a shot of whiskey to, looked perplexed and deeply concerned. "Maureen?" he called in no particular direction. An answering grunt was heard, followed shortly by the round face of Mrs. Winkler, who appeared at the serving hatch behind the bar. "It's old Blakely," Winkler said. "He's dead. Cuthbert Baxter, too, by the sound of it." Maureen, visibly taken aback, stood unmoving for a full 10 seconds. Then,
"Should we call the police?"
"I'd recommend against that for now," said Van Melsen, a serious look stamped across his face. "It'll make it nigh on impossible to wrap this mess up efficiently with police officers crawling about the place. Believe me, I know."
"Jim?"
Maureen asked, seeking reassurance. "Leave it for now, love," the landlord said, turning to Van Melsen. "What was he doing at Baxter's in the first place?" The investigator sighed. "It's my belief," he said, "that Blakely was attempting to undo his blunder. Takes a fair bit of experience to interpret what's written in that book, even when it's written in English. But as I explained to my friends here earlier, the old man was on borrowed time. He'd have never made it to Baxter's Hollow, if, after all, that was the man's ultimate destination." Big Jim shook his head. "You'll forgive me," he said tentatively, "if I say I'm having a bit of trouble swallowing all this." "You're forgiven," Van Melsen immediately responded, lighting the cigarette at last. "As I said when we first spoke over the phone, this is the kind of thing nobody ever gets used to." The distinctive smell of bacon distracted the group momentarily. Mrs. Winkler returned to the kitchen to tend to it.
"The bacon's ours,"
Annie said proudly, referring to the family business.
"It's delicious."
"I bet it is," the investigator said, licking his lips. Kane, still reeling from recent events, barked,
"I'm starving."
Big Jim chuckled at this, though the pallor of his face was still on the grey side. After a late breakfast consisting of bacon, sausages, eggs, beans, and 2 rounds of toast, Jim Winkler asked the obvious question. "So, what now?" Van Melsen, dipping up the remnants of bean juice with a corner of toast, said, "I've some reading to do. Is there somewhere I can study here?" "Of course," said Jim. "We've a couple of guest rooms upstairs. They're yours, all of you. Even you, Miss Palmer, if you want to stay among company." Annie, who had considered moving back to her parents' place temporarily on Willow Terrace, agreed to the arrangement, throwing eyes at Kane in the process. "Another thing," the investigator went on. "I see that it's quiet on the streets. Is there a way to send word to the residents? I think it's a good idea for people to stay indoors wherever possible, at least for the next day or two." "Yep," Big Jim said. "Sally Relish. She's what passes for village mayor round here. I'll see she gets the word out." "Keep the details on ice, Jim," Van Melsen warned. "We don't want people running for the hills." "Aye." Turning, the landlord grabbed several items from a drawer beneath the till. "Here," he said, dropping 5 keys on the counter. "Take your pick." By noon, Van Melsen was situated on the first floor of the Breadwinner's Grotto in Guest Room 1, a couple of books, including Millith, laid out on the bed in front of him. He was tired, both mentally and physically. The situation in Greenhill Coppice had been above and beyond what he'd been expecting. In many ways, despite the general air of confidence that emanated from his sharp shoulders, the investigator was still a little wet behind the ears. He'd been a bookish character in the early days, consuming everything he could on the broad subjects of esoterica and the occult, from the writings of Trismegistus to Swedenborg and Cephariel. He'd sought to understand the sources of all things outre, securing access to private libraries, attending the clandestine assemblies of would-be necromancers, all-night vigils in supposed haunted houses. It was this latter activity that inspired a young Peter Van Melsen to call upon his years of research and to offer his services to those in need of a confident man of occult knowledge to help identify and, wherever possible, eradicate supernatural activity. Prior to October 3rd, 1986, his experiences had been relatively mundane, debunking hoaxes left, right, and center, juvenile crooks and aging attention-seekers. But in Greenhill Coppice, in little more than 24 hours, he'd crossed the hidden veil between two realities twice, fled from and, on the second encounter, coerced a cow, those servile shapeshifters first whispered of in a much younger China. And he'd acquired a forbidden book, facsimile though it might be, with the power to subvert an extra-dimensional being. Yes, he was wet behind the ears. He felt it, too. His heart still raced in his chest, and he wondered if he'd ever feel calm again, despite his carefully conserved outward appearance. But now wasn't the time to dwell on mental and physical ailments. He was knee-deep in the Greenhill horror, and was determined to see it through to its ghastly climax. Van Melsen looked at the notes he'd taken in Baxter's Hollow, the words he'd extracted from the cow. 1. With Moonstone, summon the barn owls. 2. Grind mugwort, lavender, and yarrow. A portion must be sown. 3. With fire in belly, seek out lair. There can he return. Blimey, he breathed, his hands blindly seeking a cigarette. Lighting it, he opened his journal, a small brown leather notebook. In it were the notes he'd made back in the basement of Bodmin Books, notes pertaining to the very instructions he'd drawn from the cow. Inferences were made regarding the effect of the instructions. In the presence of Millith, Van Melsen read aloud, one must make him uncomfortable, alter the environment, force him out, and steps must be taken to ensure he can't come back, for he continuously desires to. The investigator puffed on the cigarette, wafting the smoke from his eyes. He'd have to draw on his entire knowledge to work this one out. Outside, a light fog had settled over the village. Kane and Annie, superfluous for the time being, had stepped out for a breath of fresh air. Van Melsen had warned against them straying too far from the pub, and as such they found themselves on the steps of the market hall. Despite the mist, visibility was still good enough to make out the pub on the other side of the road, and the market hall itself sat at the centre of an open square. unless Owlman swept down from directly above, and the thought had crossed their minds. They would see the threat approaching long before it could do them any harm. The two had sat in a comfortable silence for a while, before it was broken with a question.
How long have you lived here?
Cain asked Annie, sitting very close to her on the cold steps.
My whole life,
said the girl in the grey shawl, offering him a modest smile.
It's a nice place, monsters notwithstanding.
Annie smirked at that.
And all because of a book,
she said, shaking her head.
Hard to believe, isn't it?
Well, books are powerful things. I spend most of my time looking for them. You might say it's an obsession of mine.
Yes, but I doubt you'd knowingly go after a book like Mythos.
I think I would.
He said without hesitation.
But only to remove it from general circulation. To lock it away somewhere.
Really?
Annie asked, her eyes wide.
You wouldn't be tempted to read a book like that?
Tempted? Yeah.
He said.
But I like to think I'd be strong enough to resist that temptation.
Annie grinned, and her whole face lit up. The ruby of her lips, the blush of her cheeks, the dark, curly hair that crowned her head seemed glossier, and her eyes, well, there are 1,000 words to describe those boundless pools.
Sounds like a lot of hard work,
she said.
Yeah, but some causes are worth it.
Like your work here?
It's not my work, not really. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Annie's sapphire eyes widened.
Really?
She said satirically. Cain smirked, unable to prevent the flood of blood that rushed to his face.
Maybe not,
he admitted. Annie beamed. A broad, soul-stealing smile it was that, unfortunately, was quickly wiped from her face by the sound of a man screaming. "It's back!" came the voice out of the mist. "It's back, and it's taken Billy Berrycloth." Moments later, Cain and Annie caught sight of a round figure emerging from Middle Street, directly north of them. The man, repeating his mantra, continued to the west along Bodmin Road and hurled himself through the open door of the Breadwinner's Grotto.
That's Michael Spinner,
Annie said.
He's the cemetery groundskeeper up at St. Bart's.
These latter words uttered with a dawning realization.
"Come on,"
said Cain, jumping to his feet. In a matter of seconds, the two were across Bodmin Road and by the bar at the Breadwinner's, listening to the grim tale of Michael Spinner. "It took Billy, right in front of me," Spinner was saying, trying to catch his breath. Van Melsen, sharp as his shoulders, appeared beside Jim Winkler, the latter in the act of pouring a pint of bitter for the terrified man. "It's okay, Mick," said Big Jim soothingly, sliding the glass across the counter in Spinner's direction. "Take your time." Spinner sighed, taking a sip of the bitter to calm his nerves. "I don't even know what Billy was doing up there," he said, his thoughts a jumble. "I was walking along Church Walk, heading east towards the Lich Gate, when I heard a muffled yell. The mist's lying a bit thicker up there, so I didn't see where it came from immediately. I ducked under the gate and followed what I thought was the sound of boots in the long grass. Turned out these were the flapping of wings, bloody great wings that I caught just a brief glimpse of between a group of stones. You know, the chest tombs by the entrance to the church." Spinner paused to take another sip of bitter. He was trembling now. "I heard a screech then, a piercing screech that didn't do my ears any favours. They're still ringing now. Then more flapping, and a second muffled scream as whatever it was back there, hidden by the mist, took off. And I knew it had Billy in its clutches because he let out a third scream, and I recognised his voice. 'Help me,' he yelled, before that great flapping thing carried him away, screeching the whole time." And that was it. Spinner fell into an apathetic stupor, no longer interested in speaking, nor sipping from the pint mug in front of him. "Is that all, Mick?" the landlord inquired, but Spinner just shrugged, mumbling something under his breath, something to the effect of, "It's back." "Jesus Christ," Big Jim blurted, curling his fists.
Where do you suppose it's taken him?
This from Mrs. Winkler, whose head was once more poking through the serving hatch. "God only knows," Jim went on. "Mr. Van Melsen?" The investigator looked Big Jim squarely in the eye, nodded, then turned to Spinner. "Mick," he began, using the name Winkler had used. His even tone seemed to rouse the disturbed groundskeeper from his reflections. "Yes," he said with effort. "Did you get any impression whatsoever of where the thing was headed?" I dunno." "Think now. Did it fly towards the church or away from it?" Wait. Yes, I think it flew towards it." "You're certain?" "Not certain, but I think so." Van Melsen nodded, turning to Kane. "I'm developing a plan of action, but a few things will be required in order to proceed." Kane nodded, recalling vaguely some of the words spouted by the cow in the woods. "Jim," the investigator continued, "I need to get my hands on a few items." "Such as?" the landlord inquired. Some choice materials. Is there an apothecary in town?" Big Jim shook his head. Here, Maureen spoke up again.
"But Beryl Orton runs an apothecary in Bodmin. She's bound to keep some bits and pieces at home."
"Worth a shot," the landlord said. "Annie," Van Melsen continued, "do you know where this Beryl lives?"
"I do,"
she said. "Do you and Norman fancy running an errand?" As it transpired, 4 individuals went out on errands. Kane and Annie went north to Cardell Road, and Jim and Maureen Winkler went south to Lower Millpool Road to seek out Barbara Wilkes, whose twice-weekly stall at the Market Hall was dedicated to the sale of precious gemstones. If anybody had moonstones among their possessions, it would be her. Meanwhile, Van Melsen would return to his studies, requiring, he said, complete and total isolation for at least a couple of hours. This was promised him, with Jim and Maureen's eldest son, Stephen, keeping an eye on Michael Spinner in the bar area. Other locals had drifted into the pub too, and it was all the youngster could do to keep from spilling the beans regarding the abduction of Billy Berrycloth. A short time later, Kane and Annie, creeping through the fog like the ghosts of a dead village, found themselves approaching the vast residence of Beryl Horton. It wasn't like other dwellings in the village at all. Like the church, it was of brick, standing 4 stories in height, with numerous small dark windows decorating its facade like the watchful eyes of a fly. To Kane's mind, the Horton residence might once have been a mill house or similar. Whatever it was positively hideous in the clouds of swirling mist that surrounded it.
"It's a creepy old place,"
Annie said.
"but I can assure you, Miss Horton is a lovely old lady."
"Well,"
Kane replied, exhaling deeply.
"let's see if she's got what we're looking for."
The two approached the door, a heavy-looking affair with an ugly brass knocker. Kane knocked. A period of silence followed, with no signs of activity on the other side of the heavy door. Kane knocked again, and once more silence pervaded.
"What do you think?"
Kane asked. Shrugging her shoulders, Annie tried the door. It was unlocked.
"Come on,"
she said, pushing the handle down the rest of the way.
"But..."
"If she's home, we'll apologise. Trust me. I know her. I don't think she'll mind, given the circumstances."
Yielding, Kane followed the headstrong girl into the shadowy hall that awaited them.
"Hello?"
Annie called, the word echoing throughout the sparsely furnished space.
"Miss Horton?"
Kane felt that creeping dread again, the same sensation he'd felt earlier when the voice had whispered in his head. Somehow, he just knew without a doubt that Miss Horton wasn't home, that she hadn't necessarily left her abode by conventional means.
"Annie,"
he said, little more than a whisper.
"let's just find what we're looking for and get out of here. I've got a bad feeling."
Annie nodded, saying,
"Right. I know what you mean."
Miss Horton's house was even more peculiar on the inside. This, Kane hoped, being the result of the lady's eccentricity, as opposed to old Blakely's meddling with Millith.
"Have you been here before?"
Kane asked.
I've been to the door, but never inside.
This wasn't the answer the young man was hoping for. He was looking for reassurance, not more uncertainty. And into the heart of the house they went. In guest room 1 of the Breadwinner's Grotto, Van Melsen's plan of action was nearing readiness. Without the choice materials, the whole thing would be futile, but he was confident that the items required would be sourced that very afternoon. Described as the gemstone of inward vision, the purpose of the moonstone, ostensibly, was to provide a means through which to communicate with a variety of owls. Further study of Millith revealed that shapeshifters such as the Owlman are repelled by appearances of the animals they mimic. So, if Greenhill was to receive a visit from a suitably large parliament, the being might be temporarily restricted to his lair, wherever that might be. As for the elements to be ground into fine powder, the mugwort, lavender, and yarrow, this particular combination of constituents would also be repellent to the entity, providing, if sown or sprinkled in the correct place, a barrier through which the Owlman would be unable to penetrate. And then, like Annie the night before and Kane that very morning, Van Melsen became aware of a faint whispering in the back of his mind. He recognized the voice as his own, but it felt separate to him, ghostly. Listening very carefully, the voice seemed to be urging him to approach the window, that what he saw there would not be a familiar street scene, but something happening elsewhere in the village, something involving... But the voice faded to inaudibility. He didn't catch the end. He climbed to his feet and turned to face the small sash window. Indeed, it was immediately obvious that the aperture was no longer a window overlooking Bodmin Road, but a view of something gloomy and forbidding. He approached the dusky panes and cupped his hands about his face in order to get a better look at what lay beyond. From above, he saw a network of tunnels, a veritable labyrinth with floral wallpapered walls, reminiscent of a bygone age. Through these tunnels, like mice in a maze, wandered 2 individuals instantly identifiable as Norman Kane and Annie Palmer. "Norman!" Van Melsen called, rapping on the glass. He tried to open the window, but the sliding sash was immovable. "Annie!" His calls fell on deaf ears, as did his knocking, which had increased in intensity now, owing to the presence of a 3rd individual roaming the corridors, a much larger individual, all silhouette, with what appeared to be lowered wings at its bulky sides. It was a furtive beast, gliding along like a puppet on a conveyor belt, closing in on the investigator's companions, a tower of intent. "Norman!" he called again, positively pounding on the glass now. "Annie!" But it was no use. The glass was an impenetrable veil, whose sole purpose was to provide a viewing portal, and nothing more. Van Melsen knew better than to yell their names a 3rd time, and instead spun on his heel and took off at a run. "Where's the Horton house?" he demanded as he reached the bar area, startling the young Winkler boy. It's... the boy stammered. "Never mind that. Just take me there, now." Kane and Annie were well and truly lost. They'd found what they were looking for almost immediately. In a cramped room connected to the main hallway, a cabinet of drawers labelled A through Z had provided everything they sought, neatly packaged in small round tins. Grabbing as much of each as was available, they turned, feeling rather pleased with their unlikely fortune, and stepped back out into the sparsely furnished hall. But it had changed. The main door through which they had entered the house just wasn't there. Instead, they were standing in what appeared to be an endless tunnel, with numerous passageways leading off into further vagueness along its length.
"What?"
Kane began, only to give up. Annie seemed to realize what had happened instantly.
It's like the tunnel between my house and the lodge,
she said.
"We're in the fringe again."
"Shit."
Kane blurted, unable to stop himself.
What do we do?
Annie's head bobbed from side to side as she surveyed their surroundings.
We do what everyone should do when trapped in a maze. We stick to the left and keep moving.
What?
Kane asked, his brow creased. The girl in the grey shawl clutched Kane's hand and dragged him forward a few steps. From there on, Annie led the way through the wallpapered warren, sticking like glue to the left. The passages were unchanging, each the same as the last, interminably long and littered with openings, the geometry of the place completely out of whack with reality.
I'm not sure the left-hand rule is going to do us much good in this place,
Kane said, his voice a quiver. Then Annie stopped abruptly, shushing him. Kane raised his hands questioningly. Annie put a finger in the air and whispered,
Listen.
Kane listened. It took a moment, but then he heard it. It was a rustling sound, like the distant approach of 100 foil packets, sharp and incessant.
What is that?
Kane mouthed. The look on Annie's face told him that he didn't want to know. Whatever her sapphire eyes had discovered, the young bookworm had his back to it, and it was advancing at speed. Suddenly, Annie yelled,
Run!
And they took off at a rate of knots, in a straight line along the unending tunnel, all the while hounded by the weird crackling of foil packets. Kane couldn't recall the last time he'd ran like this. Had he been a boy in secondary school, forced to compete in the 200-meter sprint against his will? Perhaps he'd have been a better runner, if the soggy old weather pitch had played host to something vast and strange, a thing that squawked as it slithered along, waving unseen appendages like so many toy rattles. The thing that only Annie had seen was closing in. Kane felt the heat of its breath at the back of his neck, recognized the flapping of wings now, the furious convulsions of a feathered head. His female counterpart was much faster than him. She was several strides ahead now, on the verge of vanishing in the perpetual gloom that lay ahead. What would he do if she disappeared completely? What fate would await him if she left him alone with this looming menace? Kane didn't get to find out. Annie, her mysterious motivation still the source of sleepless nights some 30-odd years later, slowed to a trot, made a semicircle, and launched herself at the advancing threat.
Annie!
Kane screamed, coming to an abrupt halt. But the girl with the sapphire eyes, and the thing that had pursued them, were gone. The hall in which he found himself was the simple, sparsely furnished affair into which he and Annie had stepped less than an hour before. All that remained of the butcher's daughter was the grey shawl strewn across the floor. Kane collected it. Standing at the front door, backlit by the luminous fog without, was the investigator, the young Winkler boy at his side, both of them panting. The look on Van Melsen's face said everything. It took her, he said between breaths, eyeing the shawl in Kane's hands. Kane nodded, his mouth agape. Absent-mindedly, he tapped the bulging pocket of his raincoat and said, quite robotically,
Well, we got what we came for, at least.
6. Saturday, October 4th, 6:15 p.m. In the relative safety of the breadwinners, a group of locals flooded the bar area, their eyes and ears fixed upon a statuesque figure behind the bar. Van Melsen, lost for words in the presence of so many eager comers, looked to Jim Winkler, who stood beside him. Now then, said the landlord, clapping his giant hands together, this here is Peter Van Melsen. At the end of the bar there, he added, pointing to a forlorn-looking character, that's Norman Kane. These two gents have come a long way to aid us in this thing, so I'd appreciate it if the lot of you could hear 'em out. We want rid of this thing, don't we? This last comment resulted in a series of grunts and nods. The weary folk of Greenhill Coppice were ready to see the last of whatever it was that was plaguing them. The floor's yours, said Big Jim, inviting Van Melsen to address the concerned residents. "I'll get straight to the point," the investigator began, raising the copy of Millith in the air. "This is the reason you've a beast among you. Old Blakely was merely a pawn, a man manipulated by forces beyond his reckoning." "Forces?" came a voice from the crowd. "What do you mean, forces?" "I mean to say that Blakely's acquisition of this book led to the arrival of a terrible menace, a creature whose sole purpose is to take you one by one back to its own domain. Mark my words, it will continue to prey on you until this village is a ghost town." "Why?" came another voice. "What's he done with Berrycloth?" "And Baxter, for that matter," yelled another. "Look," said Van Melsen calmly, "I'm not here to answer such questions. I'm here to assure that this thing goes back to where it came from. To speculate regarding the fates of those taken would be a waste of time." Here, Kane looked up, his thoughts awash with visions of Annie Palmer disappearing in the blackness of that inexplicable labyrinth. "What are you going to do about it, then?" was another outburst. "It's my belief that this thing, this Owlman, has established for itself a nest of sorts in the vaults of St. Bartholomew's Church." Gasps were heard. The cemetery groundskeeper, Michael Spinner, listening from the back of the crowd, looked up and shuddered. Then a man sporting a clerical collar stepped forward. "I think you may be right. It was Father Stuart Redknapp, St. Bart's vicar. Just this afternoon," he went on, "I caught a whiff of something putrid radiating from the vaults. I know what's been going on recently, but I couldn't believe that an incursion on the church was a real possibility. Well, I descended the steps, there in the vestry, noticing immediately that the flight seemed to descend much deeper than it should have done. Recalling the talk of strange expansion throughout Greenhill Lodge, I took my leave, despite my commitments. Could it be that this thing has a bone to pick with our Lord?" "The Owlman dwells below," said Van Melsen. "The vaults are simply a convenient subterranean location. I presume there's external access, too?" "Yes," answered Redknapp. "There's a flight of steps by the rear crypts." "Then that's how it's been coming and going," the investigator concluded. "With that in mind—" But Van Melsen was interrupted by a series of shouts, followed by the arrival of a young man. "Quick, outside!" screamed the teenager. "It's back! Come and see for yourselves!" Like water rapidly draining from a lock, groups of frantic villagers poured from the breadwinners and fled across Bodmin Road to the market square, where the teenager now stood, pointing and yelling. Following the boy's gaze to the north, dozens of eyes traced the rooftops of Middle Street and Cardell Road, climbed the grass verge that rose at the back of the village hall, and landed on the looming facade of St. Bart's, its single rose window, the eye of the church, gazing back with a fear of its own. Under clear skies atop the church, straddling the 10-foot cross at its apex, squatted something terrible. Jim Winkler saw it, as did his wife and son. Michael Spinner was there too, the reassuring hand of the vicar on his shoulder. Barbara Wilkes saw it, and trembled from head to toe. Norman Kane saw it, and Peter Van Melsen saw it. It was Millith, a giant, feathered man with a pair of wings and the head of an owl. But it was more than that. In the swiftly diminishing daylight, there was a translucency about it, a wraith-like quality that suggested the creature wasn't of this world, that it wouldn't ever be of this world, despite its dreadful presence and the tremendous power it commanded over the populace of Greenhill Coppice. Its wings were broad and white, angelic of themselves, dramatically contrasting with that appalling oval-shaped head, the deep red eyes of which scanned the gathered crowd with quiet hostility. And though the long body of the beast was undoubtedly shaped like a man's, there was something immensely unsettling about it, as though, even from the quarter of a mile distance from which the onlookers observed it, the trunk was queerly aquiver with a life of its own. The notion of safety in numbers held the crowd together, an intangible feeling that seemed to prevail in the end. For after an untold number of minutes, which might have been only a matter of seconds, Millith withdrew from its lofty perch and swooped away into the shelter of the woods to the north. Following the public spectacle, Big Jim and the sort of Mayor, Sally Relish, eventually succeeded in convincing the majority of the onlookers to head home, to lock themselves away for the night, and to sleep wherever possible, in groups. Those who lived alone sought the company of neighbours, with only one or two particularly stubborn individuals choosing to ignore such recommendations, insisting that they weren't afraid of no big fellow with wings. In relating his plan, at least as much of it he felt was relevant to share, Van Melsen insisted that only a select number of people be in attendance, so it was in Winkler's back room at the Breadwinners that Kane, Big Jim, Relish, and Father Redknapp listened in rapt silence to what he had to say. "I am by no means certain that this will work," Van Melsen said, "but it's my duty to at least give it a try. There are a number of stages, each of which is fraught with potential complications, but I'll spare you the specifics for now. Just know this: the first stage, involving a chant and a precious stone, will be carried out this evening by the brook. Please," and this he added with a very stern expression creasing his brow, "do your very best to keep it dark." At 9 p.m., Van Melsen, with a noticeably subdued Kane at his side, approached the edge of Greenhill Brook, accessed through the beer garden at the back of the pub. Jim and Maureen had been fortunate enough to retrieve 3 red moonstones from Barbara Wilkes, all of which the investigator now clutched in his lean hand. "There'll be time later," Van Melsen said, looking at the young man sympathetically, "to reflect on what happened to her." Kane nodded, well aware that his despondence could have a detrimental effect on proceedings.
"I know," he said. "We've got a job to do here. Let's do it."
The ritual was a simple one. With the moonstone submerged in flowing water, 3 words were to be spoken aloud. "Here goes nothing," Van Melsen began, his inexperience at last apparent to Kane. Crouching, he plunged his closed fist into the water and muttered, "Noctua, Terrori, Millith." Kane stood by, waiting for something to happen, knowing very well that the summoning would take time. The investigator climbed to his feet. "We should head indoors, Norman," he said, shaking a wet fist. "If this doesn't work, we'll want to be inside, though with those cows haunting the borderlands of 3-dimensional reality, I'm not sure we'll be safe anywhere." But Kane had nothing to say. After what had happened to Annie, anything was possible. If nothing else, the pair needed a good night's rest. With or without the aid of their summoned nocturnal friends, it would be necessary to descend into the vaults of St. Bart's on the morrow. A few hours later, with a couple of minutes left on the clock prior to midnight, Kane, who lay atop the covers in room 2, wide awake, his eyes fixed on the oblongs of streetlight decorating the ceiling, became aware of a light tapping sound. It wasn't at all like the knocking that had roused him at the lodge the night before, the fateful rapping that had introduced him to the now-missing butcher's daughter. No, this was much lighter, and it was a tapping against glass, not wood. He sat up on the bed and craned round to look at the window. His searching gaze discovered a heart-shaped head looking back at him, the unmistakable face of a barn owl. It had come to Kane, tapping away at the glass with its short beak. The young man, like one in a dream, climbed from the bed and approached the window. He slid the sash across and dropped to his knees in front of the midnight caller.
"Hello,"
he said dumbly. Strange though the circumstances were, it was unlikely that the bird would return his greeting. Instead, it simply shrugged its wings and continued to stare at him, unblinking.
"Are you answering the call?"
But the pale owl, its mien inscrutable, remained still and indifferent. Cain watched the bird, was quietly fascinated by it. He'd seen owls at sanctuaries, caught glimpses of them disturbed by the headlights of cars, but had never sat face to face with one of its own volition. Was it of its own volition? Or had Van Melsen's summons cast a spell over the hapless creature? According to the investigator, the purpose of the summons was to infest the area with owls, to make the village inhospitable to Millith. But this owl had knocked at the window. This owl had remained at the window after Cain had greeted it. There was something special about this little fellow, if fellow it was.
"Let's call you Odie,"
Cain said, in response to which the little barn owl shrugged its shoulders again.
"I see you approve,"
he added, chuckling to himself. And then Odie hissed, which, to Cain's mind at least, sealed the deal.
"I can tell we're going to be fast friends, Odie."
Cain remained there by the bird for what felt like a very long time, an hour or more. Odie, whose name Cain had plucked from the word Odyssey, was a calming presence, a presence that served to remind the young man that every horror, be it supernatural or otherwise, was matched by an equivalent delight. With Odie at the window, his next attempt at sleep was much more successful. Meanwhile, across the hall in room 1, the paranormal investigator was lost in a haze of thoughts, sat by the window, looking not upon a strange labyrinth, but quiet Bodmin Road, the dock end of a player's cigarette hanging from his bottom lip. At least, he pondered, the arrival of the barn owls, if the summons were successful, would serve to nullify the incursions of the cows, drawn as they were by the presence of their would-be master. Van Melsen's mind was awash with appalling imagery. The elderly lady of wood behind the wardrobe at Greenhill Lodge, the translucent skin of old Blakely at Barker's Row, the image of Cuthbert Baxter, a mere sculpture forced to yield its secrets, and Millith himself, or the form in which Millith had chosen to assume, the very form that would, with a pinch of luck, be the creature's undoing. From where the creature came, Van Melsen could only surmise, based on the numerous clues present in the small book Blakely had so greedily acquired in Ilfracombe. In describing Millith's reality, the writer of the book, the mysterious Montaigne, had conjured up a curious allegory. "We occupy but a page," went a paragraph on the subject, "in the book of reality. Other realms are close at hand, separated by little more than a whisper. Millith knows this, and, countless eons ago, sought to discover a means through which to conquer those whispers, so that the crossing from one reality to another was as simple as putting one's foot through an open door." "Why is it," Van Melsen muttered to himself, "that only the malevolent forces of other realities seek to penetrate into ours?" But the desolate road outside failed to offer an answer, nor did the dead cigarette butt, which now fell to the floor. The investigator ignored it and threw himself onto the bed. Unlike the young bookworm, Van Melsen would get very little sleep that night. Sunday, October 5th, 7 a.m. When the investigator made his way downstairs that Sunday morning, his eyes bloodshot with great black rings surrounding them, he found himself drawn to the smell of bacon on the grill. He followed the scent into the dining room, where sat Cain opposite Big Jim, Maureen, and young Stephen. Seeing Van Melsen enter, the landlord sent his boy off to the kitchen to fetch what had been prepared for the man. Van Melsen took a seat next to Cain and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" Big Jim asked. "So-so," the investigator returned, sipping the coffee. "Tell him about your visitor," the landlord continued, looking at Cain. Cain, who at that moment was working his way through a substantial sausage, nodded.
"Odie,"
he said between bites. "What?" Van Melsen begged.
"Odie,"
Cain said again.
"my old friend. Arrived last night. Spent the whole night perched on the window frame. Still there now, as far as I know.
The investigator's eyes widened, both in response to Kane's admission and the fact that Stephen Winkler had just returned to the room carrying a full English breakfast. 2 rashers of bacon, 2 fat sausages, 2 fried eggs, a smattering of mushrooms, a portion of beans, half a tomato, and 2 rounds of brown toast. "Thank you," Van Melsen said as the plate was placed in front of him. A conversation ensued, in which Kane spoke of his feelings concerning his nocturnal friend, of how the creature instilled in him a sense of calm, and, more than that, a sense of optimism. The investigator went on to say that the arrival of Odie would certainly hail the advent of further owls, creating precisely the atmosphere in the village necessary to keep Millith from venturing outside. "For a short time, at least," he added cautiously, dipping a slice of toast in the yolk of a fried egg. "We must take advantage of the situation by striking while Millith's suppressed. He must be forced to return to where he came from."
What about the missing?
Maureen put in.
Can we expect anyone to come home afterwards?
Van Melsen shrugged his shoulders, shooting an apologetic glance at Kane in the process. "I'd like to think so," he said guardedly. "But the truth is, if the case of Cuthbert Baxter is anything to go by, the damage is likely to be irreversible." A cool silence followed, permeated only by the sounds of eating and drinking. "It's going to be a long day," Big Jim said, breaking the silence. And it was, for the vaults of St. Bart's couldn't be entered prior to twilight. Time had to be allowed for the owls to arrive, and with perhaps the exception of Odie, the birds wouldn't show themselves in broad daylight. After breakfast, Van Melsen was introduced to Odie. He was immediately taken by the owl's unusual temperament, and fascinated by its apparent attachment to Norman Kane. "His eyes are glued to you," the investigator observed.
Her eyes?
Kane corrected.
Odie's a female.
"Oh, my apologies, Odie," Van Melsen offered.
What do you think it means?
Kane asked. "At a guess, I'd say she's a warden of some kind."
A warden?
"Yes, a guardian, sent to see that we find our way."
To the vaults?
"Through the vaults, I suspect. Do you think you'd have found your way out of that wallpapered maze if Annie hadn't sacrificed herself?"
I guess not.
And here Kane seemed afflicted by a horrible realization.
Does that mean Odie'll have to sacrifice herself too?
Van Melsen shook his head vehemently. "I'm not saying that. I'm just guessing here. It's my belief that Odie will serve as a guide of sorts through the vaults, to see that our efforts aren't in vain. That's all." Kane nodded thoughtfully. "Listen," the investigator said. "I know this whole situation is, well, beyond anything either of us could have imagined, but I'm absolutely convinced that we will succeed today. Call it a feeling, intuition, whatever. One should always trust that inner voice." Once more, Kane nodded, thinking back to the inner voice he had heard the day before. That monotonous voice, spouting an unintelligible mantra, producing images of an oppressive passageway and dissonant roars. If he was to trust that voice, then something truly horrible loomed on the horizon, something even more terrible, perhaps, than what had happened to Annie in the wallpapered maze. Van Melsen and Kane shared a look then, a look coloured by unspoken worry and bewilderment. They'd talked enough. They knew what lay ahead. The rest of the morning and seemingly distant afternoon would be spent in quiet contemplation, a silent rehearsal, if you will. It was Odie who had the final word, a quiet shriek that, given what lay ahead, sounded like a warning signal. Seven. Sunday, October 5th, 5:30 p.m. Van Melsen and Kane stood by the quiet bar of the Breadwinners, a pair of whiskey glasses on the counter before them. Doesn't get much hotter than that, said Big Jim, referring to the bottle of Isla single malt from which he'd poured the proffered drinks. Kane, without hesitation, downed the contents of his glass, his reaction afterwards that of a seasoned professional, while inside his throat was a cavern of heat. Van Melsen followed suit, barely managing to stifle a cough as he did so. "Blimey," he breathed. "'Tis a bellyful of fire indeed." Big Jim grinned, nodding knowingly. "And the whiskey is supposed to do what again?" he asked, scratching his head. "Provides a bit of Dutch courage," Van Melsen said.
"I thought you were the Dutch courage,"
Kane said, in reference to the investigator's surname. Van Melsen chuckled, saying, "My father would approve of that." Kane was tempted to inquire as to the man's heritage at this juncture, but, given what the two of them were up against, decided to save such questioning for a rainy day. "Come on," said Van Melsen. "We've got work to do." Big Jim had decided to close the pub for the night, though villagers who lived alone were welcome to hang around if they so desired. The vicar stood by, as did Sally Relish, who, along with Jim and Maureen, offered prayers and blessings as the intrepid duo left the breadwinners. As they stepped into the chill of the October evening, Odie was immediately seen atop the pub's sign, waiting for them.
"Hello,"
Kane called.
"Are you coming with us?"
The owl shrugged its wings, then took off in a northerly direction. The pair noticed other night birds in the vicinity, numerous owls atop rooftops and lampposts, hoots arising from the encircling trees of Cardinham Woods. "It worked," Van Melsen muttered, mostly to himself. "It actually worked." The investigator's surprise stirred something in the young bookworm. It was further clarification that the occult detective wasn't as self-assured as he'd originally thought. He, like Kane, had waded up to his chin into the unknown, a reality of high strangeness that usurped all his previous investigations. Van Melsen had muttered of visits to abandoned lighthouses, tape recordings made in deserted cemeteries, but this, to be in the presence of a true Fortean beast, it seemed, was unprecedented.
"Do you really think we can get rid of this thing?"
Kane asked suddenly, catching his counterpart with his defences down. In response to this, Van Melsen withdrew a cigarette. Kane had noticed this quirk before. The act of lighting a cigarette provided the man with the time needed to think up answers to questions for which he had no answer. "Absolutely," the man in the long black overcoat said, puffing on the white stick. "Not a doubt in my mind." Bluster restored, he took off in the direction of Middle Street. Crossing the bridge over Greenhill Brook, the two continued in silence till they reached Bartholomew's Rise, a short but steep street, leading directly north to Church Walk. Above them, like the hulking lookout it was, loomed the massive red-brick church, its single eye reflecting the last of the daylight. There was nothing reassuring about that neo-Gothic monstrosity, nothing that spoke to the spirit. It seemed to speak only of danger and foreboding. This, then, Kane mused, was what had necessitated the glass of single malt. The pair continued up the street, their gazes locked on the eye of the church. Not once did that stained glass rose window avert its intimidating glare. Reaching Church Walk, Kane spotted Odie atop the lich gate. The bird shrieked warmly, a glorious, wholesome sound that invigorated the questing duo. "That bird of yours, Norman," Van Melsen said. "She's quite a sight." And she was. In the vanishing light of the evening, Odie's fawn feathers were luminous, her large eyes the colour and lustre of polished Whitby jet. The men passed through the lich gate and made their way to the back of the church, where, by the rear crypts, as directed by Father Redknapp, they would find a short flight of stone steps. And they found them without effort, thanks to Odie, who had made her way to the crumbling tomb above them and was sitting atop it, hissing pleasantly.
"How does she know where we're heading?"
Kane asked. Van Melsen shook his head, saying, "I haven't the foggiest. Perhaps it has something to do with Millith having taken the form of an owl. Cain shuddered then, remembering the sight of the Owlman at the top of the church beneath which they now stood, the very creature that had pursued him and Annie along those interminable passageways.
Are you ready?
He asked, eager to put an end to the business. The investigator nodded, extinguishing the remains of the cigarette between thumb and index finger. Guided by the seemingly luminous glow of Odie above them, the men approached the flight of steps and peered into the gloom below.
Didn't the vicar say there were a door down there?
Cain said, squinting. If there was a door down there, Van Melsen returned, frowning, it's gone now. And he was right. Below them was merely a dark opening in the cold earth, beyond which only blackness lay. Well, Van Melsen grunted, clearing his throat. We'd better prepare ourselves. From his satchel, the investigator plucked a hand torch. Cain produced the one Big Jim had loaned him from a coat pocket. Van Melsen then spent a moment or two rummaging through the satchel for the small tin he'd packed. The tin, acquired by Cain and Annie at Beryl Horton's place, now contained a small portion of what he referred to as the solution. Where exactly the solution would be sown was a matter to be determined at a later time. For the moment, the pair could be at least reassured by the presence of Odie and the innumerable other night birds that just then were hooting and swooping in and out of the cemetery smattering of trees, the owls and the unsung comfort of the single malt now deep in their bellies. Let's go, Van Melsen said, beginning the descent. Cain, swallowing the butterflies that rose in his throat, followed directly behind, waving in an empty sort of way at Odie as he did so. The bird, in silence, glided down from its position above them and landed on the young man's shoulder. In any other reality, Odie's simple act would have been mesmerizing, uncanny, but here and now, with the gloomy mouth below threatening to swallow them whole, it was just another event in a carefully orchestrated sequence. It was a strange descent, horrifying and deeply unsettling, but in the main, strange. 2 oblongs of light danced across the stone walls of the sloping passage, Odie's wide black eyes caught by them sporadically. A mausolean silence haunted the tunnel, every resounding footstep an intrusion. And the scent, an otherworldly odour, not the kind of smell one might associate with graveyards and catacombs, but a bittersweet perfume that lingered on the back of the palate, like the duplicitous notes of cyanide. Van Melsen, first in the descent, was aware of his dilating pupils as his brain fought to construe the dancing beams and the total blackness that surrounded them. He clung to the small tin in his left hand like a man overboard might cling to a buoy. For the tin was a lifeline, their lifeline, his and Norman's, the young bibliophile he'd pulled into a weird nightmare. What if something was to happen to Cain under his guidance? A fate similar to that of Annie, the sapphire-eyed girl that had quite literally stolen Cain's heart. Listen, he whispered, turning to face Cain in the darkness, ignoring for the nonce the strangeness of the owl perched atop his shoulder. Why don't you head back? I'll take it from here.
What?
Cain returned, frowning. You shouldn't be here. You wouldn't be if we hadn't bumped into each other the other day.
Wouldn't I?
Van Melsen frowned. What do you mean?
I don't know. I can't explain it. Seems you were waiting for me in that basement.
Perhaps I was.
So you admit it then?
Well, here the investigator hesitated, and would have fumbled for a cigarette if he'd a hand spare. Not consciously, anyway. It was just a feeling, like a voice in the back of my mind had directed me to that bookshop. Later, the two would discuss the voices they'd heard. They'd connect them to the voice Annie had heard too, but there and then, in the hush of that dark tunnel, their voices were a bigger concern.
Now you listen,
Cain said quietly.
We're going together. That's it. And Odie's coming too.
It was fortunate that, Right then, Odie merely shrugged her wings, as opposed to announcing their incursion with a reverberant shriek. The descent continued. After several minutes, the men reached the bottom of the sloping passage. Beyond, there lay before them a large chamber of sorts, not the conglomeration of maze-like tunnels that was supposed to comprise the vaults. And this chamber, dank and putrid, was pitch black. Only the torchlight could provide clues as to the extent of the space and its contents. "This place shouldn't be here," Van Melsen whispered.
You think we've crossed a border again?
Kane ventured. "Undoubtedly." Odie was shuffling impatiently, her feathers ruffling Kane's hair.
"What is it, girl?"
he asked, shining his torch close to her heart-shaped face. But the owl couldn't speak, could only employ body language to communicate a message. And this message, as interpreted by the young man, was that they weren't to go any further into the chamber. Shining his torch at their feet, Van Melsen observed a faint, white line, a line in the very stone beneath them, indicative, perhaps, of where the vaults ended and the vast chamber began. Further torchlight scans of the space beyond revealed other oddities, stacks of dead wood and piles of colourless leaves, curious mounds of dark brown soil, and everywhere a shiny residue like snail slime. The air was close and humid, lending a horrible oppressiveness to proceedings.
"It's a nest,"
Kane ventured.
"but it's no owl's nest,"
he added, shuddering. "You may be right," Van Melsen agreed, studying the white line at his feet. "Here," he went on. "This is the spot. The solution must be sown right here." Van Melsen's excitement got the better of him. This is evidenced by the words, "right here," echoing throughout the vast chamber beyond. Handing his torch to Kane, he opened the small tin, and was about to begin sprinkling it on the ground, when another voice filled the space. "Talk about Dutch courage," came the strange voice, and it was strange, at least to Van Melsen's ears, for it belonged to his father, a man long dead. Odie shrieked then, an indication that their attempts at stealth were no longer necessary. But the investigator remained silent. "Look at you, fumbling about in the dark, and you dare call yourself a professional." And the stranger, unrevealed by the searching torchlights, laughed hideously. Van Melsen was frozen in place, mesmerized by the sinister voice. With Odie shuffling wildly now, Kane, unaware of the reason for his partner's hesitation, grabbed the tin from his hands, pushed him aside, and immediately began sprinkling the solution on the ground. "What's this?" the horrible voice continued, somewhat distorted now. "Afraid to get your niece dirty, are we, Peter?" Right then, Van Melsen snapped out of the trance that had held him. But it was too late. A chain of events had been set in motion that he was incapable of averting. "Norman!" he yelled, the cry redoubled by the sudden screeching of Odie, who, spooked by something, flew into the air, flapping her wings violently above their heads. Kane, crouched as he was, glanced upwards to witness the appalling approach of what can only be described as a quivering black mass. Even in the light of the torches that Van Melsen shone upon it, the thing appeared as black as the space between the stars, advancing with the relentless determination of a predator on the savannah. "Move!" Van Melsen screamed, but the command was futile. Kane dropped the tin, spilling the rest of its contents haphazardly on the stone floor. Bracing himself for the impact of the thing, he instinctively threw his arms up in the air, one last, fruitless act of self-defense. But the thing, seemingly larger than the chamber it occupied, extended dark, coiling tendrils towards those raised limbs, took them in its damp, sticky grip, and pulled hard. The pain was so great that it brought tears to the eyes of the young man. He felt as though his arms would pop out of their sockets. He screamed, a meaningless, wordless howl that did nothing to deter his pursuer. In the beams of light that still danced about the mass, Kane caught fleeting glimpses of facial features, apertures that could have been mouths, eyes, or nostrils, protuberances that might once have passed for imitation feathers, flashes of colour indicative of otherworldly, kaleidoscopic biology that, even as the thing held him, vice-like, was impossible to fully comprehend. With Odie in the air above his head, flapping her wings maniacally, the young man listened intently to the mumbling of Van Melsen, who, by the light of one of the torches, was flipping back and forth through the copy of Mythos, looking for anything that might be of use to them in the moment. "Hold on, Norman!" the investigator yelled periodically, as his hopeless search continued. And it was hopeless, for Kane could no longer fight the pull of the creature. It had been weakened, no doubt, by the presence of the solution beneath his feet. The white line was now a dangerous border that the beast simply couldn't cross. But Kane's arms were over this line, and soon enough he too would be over the line, dragged into a nightmare world beyond the reckoning of man. What could he do? What could he say? Wasn't this the stage in the nightmare where you awoke screaming? No, this wasn't a nightmare, and the screaming was ongoing. And then, just as he was about to yield to the creature, leaving Van Melsen to ponder the young man's fate for the remainder of his days, there sounded yet another voice, a voice that emanated from the darkness beyond the black shape. It was Annie's voice.
"No!"
she yelled.
"No more!"
But that was all. Kane never caught a glimpse of her, nor did he hear her voice again. All he saw, all Van Melsen saw, was a rapid rotation of shadows before them, like the frantic revolutions of a great wheel. Round and round the shadows went, gradually reducing in size. It was the closing of a localized rift, but there, stretched across the dark border, were Kane's arms, held in the unyielding grip of the spiraling Mythos. It was over in an instant, the briefest of moments. The swirling blackness reduced to zero, leaving nothing behind. The chamber, the nest of Mythos, was gone. Van Melsen rushed to Kane's side, but what he saw there truly shocked him. Odie swooped down from above, landing next to her friend, careful not to disturb him, for there he sat, cross-legged on the stone floor, illuminated now by the orange bulbs of the vaults, his arms missing from the elbow down. Postface. Norman Kane, by the piano in Kane's rare books, with surprising deftness, topped up Wax's tumbler. Topping up his own, he sighed, a touch of melancholy colouring his pale cheeks. Wax was at a loss for words, had been at a loss for words throughout the entire spinning of Kane's curious yarn. She looked at him, saw the sadness, looked at his plastic hands, shook her head.
"I know,"
he said.
"There's a reason folk rarely get to hear that story."
Wax sipped at the contents of her glass. Whiskey had never tasted quite so mundane. The art and design student with the kinky hair was no stranger to weirdness. It was one of the reasons she'd come to know Norman in the first place. But this was next-level stuff. And then an unusual expression washed over her face, one of excitement and intrigue.
"What about the book?"
she asked eagerly.
"Do you still have it?"
Kane nodded.
"I do. It formed the basis of the private collection."
Wax swallowed audibly, knowing that the subject of Norman's secret stash was generally taboo.
"It's downstairs,"
she asked, her voice full of wonder.
"It is,"
he replied.
"Although the old man Blakely tore out and burned a great deal of it, me and Peter still felt it needed to be put under lock and key."
"Were the police called in?"
"Yeah, the disappearances of Annie Palmer, Cuthbert Baxter, William Barrycloth, and of course Michael Blakely, whose body disappeared from Baxter's house on Barker's Row, had to be reported. But we decided, and the residents of Greenhill were in agreement here, to keep our mouths shut. None of us mentioned the Book of Millith, Owlman, the cows, etc. As for my arms,
he added, noticing Wax's gaze fixed on his plastic ones.
They were just gone. Like I'd never had arms below the elbow. No blood, no wounds. I told my friends up here that I'd been in an accident and that the circumstances were just too painful to discuss. Parents were long gone, which I suppose spurred me from what would have been the most difficult explanation of all.
Kane sighed, looking down at his imitation hands.
What happened to Odie?
Wax asked. This brought a smile to Kane's weathered face.
The little beggar stayed with me for a while,
he said, with real warmth.
Nursed me back to health. Went back to her own after that. I'll tell you this for now, she was one of a kind, that one.
Wax grinned, enjoying her employer's sincerity.
What about the voice you heard?
She went on.
The inner voice.
Kane nodded, saying,
Ah, no couth. The swinging pendulum. That's a story for another day.
Undeterred, Wax asked,
And Annie? Do you think she's still out there somewhere?
I hope so. After all,
he said, reaching for something hidden amongst a pile of scarves.
I still have a shawl.
And out it came, Annie's grey shawl, musty with age, suggestive of missed opportunities and a life unlived. Wax gasped, placing a hand over her mouth.
I dream about her all the time.
Kane continued, clutching the shawl.
Lives in a big old house. She can't find a way out, and I can't find a way in.
Wax frowned at this.
A big old house?
She repeated. Kane nodded, his eyes narrowing.
Sometimes I dream of a big old house,
she said.
Surrounded by water, with mountains in the distance.
Here she paused, as though searching for something important.
And there's someone inside who wants to get out, but they can't find a way out. And just as you said, I can't find a way in.
Absently, Kane reached for his tumbler, bringing it to his lips blindly.
Who's inside?
He asked gingerly. Wax shrugged her shoulders.
I don't know. It's more of a feeling than anything else.
A big old house, surrounded by water, mountains in the distance.
Kane repeated, lost in his thoughts.
Do you know a place like that?
Wax asked.
Not yet,
he answered.
Not yet.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.